What makes you think that you're doing the kids that are grandstanding any favors by going along with their manipulation?
Because I can't decide.
Because I would say you're allowing attention-seeking and somewhat narcissistic undergraduates to gain the upper hand over you in your class.
Professor Peterson, I teach students. I teach trans students, and I'm asked often to call people singularly they. It started probably about 4 years ago. It struck me as very odd. I'm 52. And some of them, you can tell that it's coming from a very deep place, and that's how they feel, and they deeply need to be called they. Some of them, my horse sense says that they're kind of enjoying giving me a certain shock, and that there's a certain theatrical aspect. It's my horse sense that there's a certain épate la bourgeois aspect to it. I kind of feel it, and I'm probably right. But I can't know. I'm a linguist, I'm a person, and my general feeling has been, whatever they ask, just go with it, and let's change our usage of the pronouns, because we have a lot to do. Now, what you said was interesting. You said that the way that you make the difference in deciding these cases is based on the fact that you have psychological training and you can tell. What I want to know is, for my own elucidation, and also because I think many of us wondered, but then it kind of went by, how do you know? Now, I want to specify, I'd rather you didn't recount the whole episode of how ridiculously you were treated amidst that whole controversy.
Sure. Yeah.
3/4 of the room knows, I sympathize with you, I thought it was ridiculous. I want to know specifically, because I'm a linguist, you have psychological training. How would you know?
Well,
and if you hear, I'm almost done.
Oh yeah, no
If you hear a tiny bit of skepticism in my voice, you're correct. However, I am open to being convinced. Based on your training, which is immense, how would you know which students to discount as opposed to which ones to go along with?
Okay, well, first of all, I wouldn't know, right? Which is partly why your skepticism is justified. But I have to be responsible for what I say based on my willingness to take responsibility for my judgment. So I would be willing to do that despite the fact that I might be wrong. But having said that, in any reasonable situation, I would err on the side of addressing the person in the manner that they requested to be addressed. But that's not the issue for me. The issue is now I'm compelled by law to do so. It's like, no, not doing it, not now, because it's compelled by law. So that's the end of the game as far as I'm concerned. So, because there is no excuse for compelling it by law. That's my position, and I think there's all sorts of reasons for that. I don't think it was an isolated legislative move. I think it's part and parcel of a whole sequence of legislative moves that have been made and that continue to be made in Canada. I think it's an attempt by a certain radical ideological, what would you say, a certain radical ideology to gain the linguistic upper hand, which I think is a terrible thing to do, to allow. So I had lots of reasons for rejecting the legislation, but it had nothing to do with it.
Very interesting. We're talking about expertise here, and my ears pricked up when you talked about how there is a way of thinking that would allow us to decide. I know some of my students...
No, there's a way of thinking that would allow me to decide for me.
No, us to decide for us. Surely you have a larger mission than just what's going on in your own head, and I mean that.
No, I had a perfectly straightforward mission, which was there's no damn way I was going to say those words when I was compelled to by law.
But
that was my mission.
You weren't trying to model for the rest of us a way of thinking. It was really only about you?
No, well, it was about me and the law. I thought the lawmakers had gone too far. They'd stepped out of their appropriate territory into the domain of linguistic freedom. And as far as I was concerned, I was going to put up with that. And so if people were happy about that and wanted to follow the example, well, that was fine with them. But for me, it was something, and that was the statement. I'm not doing this. And then if people can draw their own conclusions from that, maybe they want to do it. I mean, and I've spoken with no shortage of trans people, and you know, my proclivity has been without exception so far to address them in the manner that seems most socially appropriate under the circumstances. Now, you asked, you asked a specific question, which was, do I have special expertise that I might share with other people?
You're doing Martin Luther, and I think that these issues are a little subtler than those. And so
well,
I'm
what
just
makes
waiting.
what makes you think that you're doing the kids that are grandstanding any favors by going along with their
Because
manipulation?
I can't decide which ones those are.
Well,
I just have my gut instincts, and that's not good enough.
Look, fair enough, but you have a type 1 and type 2 error problem. So one error is that you don't call students what they deserve to be called. That's one error. And the other error is that you call students what they want to be called even though they don't deserve it. And so what you're trying to do optimally is to minimize both those errors. And to do that, you have to take a middle route. Now, what you've decided to do, and I'm not criticizing it, is you've decided to allow for the possibility 100% of one of those errors because you think it's a less significant error. And, you know, you might be right, but it's not like you're acting in an error-free manner. You've just decided to minimize one form of error at the expense of the other. Because I would say you're allowing what would you call it, attention-seeking and somewhat narcissistic undergraduates to gain the upper hand over you in your class. Now, and believe me, it's not a criticism. It's not a criticism. I understand why you're doing it.
Isn't John just erring on the side of generosity and compassion?
I have one more thing to say, because
Sure.
I'm not going to take up any more space.
Okay.
Are you saying that psychological theory has nothing to teach us about this? Because you're talking around my question. You're gorgeously articulate. You're smarter than me. Does psychology have anything to teach us or not? Yes or no?
I don't
On
think,
this question.
I don't think that it has anything to teach. I don't think it has anything to offer that I could teach you without. Let me think.
So it's just too complicated?
No, it's not. No, it's not that. Well, it is that in part because it's not easy to articulate out the principles, the unerring principles by which you would make such a categorical judgment, right? Because those are very situation-specific problems, you know, and it's part of the problem of how to make a generic moral truth applied to a very individualistic situation. And the problem in the sorts of situations that you're describing is generally the devil's in the details, right? You have all these students, the ones that you just laid out, they vary in their attitude towards their self-professed gender from the ones who are grandstanding to some degree, let's say, to the ones that are very serious. And you have to make a judgment in the moment that is dependent on the variables that present themselves in a very complex way in that situation. And I understand why you took the pathway that you took, and it's perfectly reasonable to do so. My point was that you don't minimize all the errors by doing so. It's fine. It's still a fine way of approaching. It isn't. My point was that because of my psychological acumen, I would say, that the experience that I've derived is that I would be comfortable in making the judgment and taking the consequential risk. I'm not saying I'd be correct. That's not the same thing at all. I'm willing to suffer the consequences of my error. That's not the same thing as being right. And so if I feel that a student is manipulating me, then I'm not going to go along with it. Now, I might be wrong about that and actually hurt someone who's genuinely asking for something that they need. But I'm also, what would you say, sensitive to the error of allowing manipulation to go unchecked.
I don't agree with why Dr. Peterson has been asked to stop abusing students. It's not correct that there is such a thing as biological sex. My physical, emotional life and livelihood is at risk from being here.
The issue with the law is quite straightforward. The government is requiring us to use certain language. That's not the same as not using certain language. And it's a line, and this is the fundamental issue. This is maybe the fundamental issue. That's a line we should not cross. We should not allow the government to decide which words we're allowed to use. It's a mistake. And it's a mistake that strikes right at the heart of free speech. And the thing about free speech is that it's not the right to criticize your leaders, which is what people usually characterize it as. Is freedom of speech is freedom to engage in the processes that we use to formulate the problems in our society, to generate solutions to them and reach a consensus. It's actually a mechanism. It's not just another value. And you should put constraints on free speech with the most extreme caution because you interfere with people's ability to think and communicate.
I think for me, one of the things that I felt anxious about coming in, and I'm still puzzling over, why this issue? Why this issue? I don't see the connections that Jordan is making. And as a person who identifies as transgender, it's very, very confusing that this is somehow up for discussion.
You saw the tape at the beginning of the program of the. I mean, he tried to give a speech at a university campus, and was really quite mercilessly shouted down.
Okay.
And that would be one of the places where Jordan and I would have some common ground in that there has been a trend in some ways for people to allow no platforming, and this person's views are objectionable and we don't want them to come on the campus.
What do you think of that?
I think it's probably best not discussed in the context of someone's personal identity, right? So that's part of what I'm bothered by this discussion. So
if you can't have a discussion about free speech on a university campus, then I guess you can't have one, because that's supposed to be where they happen, isn't it?
I agree with you. I think that is a problem. What I'm trying to say is that, you know, those issues came up around issues of someone who was pro-Israel who wanted to come onto a campus. Those things are political. My identity, my personal identity, my gender identity is very separate from my political identity. And so it's very strange to have this to be where we're going to plant the flag and say, enough with this crazy political correctness. You don't get to choose your pronouns.
I thought
it seems trivial to me.
I thought it was an axiom, say, of feminism, for example, that the personal was political. And isn't that that's a famous phrase, the personal is political.
Okay,
The personal is political when someone is attacking you on a basis that is personal and that you can't change about yourself. That is political, and that's when people sometimes become politicized, is when they realize that no matter what they do in the world, there will be people who will continue to attack them on racist grounds, on gender and sexual violence grounds, and that's why people start to fight back, and that's why people object.
And your attempts to regulate my language use, and
I don't care about your language use. I care about the safety of the people who are being harmed.
I know people who make your kinds of arguments are always concerned with other people's safety.
I'm concerned with my own safety. Just so that people are aware, my physical, emotional life and livelihood is at risk from being here, and that's not true of everyone.
In comparison to mine, say.
I don't know about yours because
yes,
I don't live your life.
You know perfectly well about mine.
I do know that you have
about the
tenure,
letter.
and that's one of the major ways that you're able to do this. But I just want people to be aware that trans and gender diverse communities, and especially people of color, are being targeted and threatened physically. So free speech is a great idea, and equality is a great idea, but we actually can't have those conversations when people are not even able to be present.
Jordan, let me read this tweet to you, and I'll get you to respond to it, because I think it's instructive of the conversation that just took place between the two of you. Can someone please explain to Jordan B. Peterson that there's a difference between freedom of speech and freedom from consequence? Do you agree there's a difference?
Well, certainly there's a difference.
And are you prepared to suffer the consequences that society may deem you need to suffer because of your views?
Yes, I'm prepared to do that.
What does that entail?
Are you open to learning?
Well, hang on.
That's not the question.
Hang on, that wasn't the question.
It's
That's
true.
Right.
Well, so what am I willing to do? Well, I think that the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal is probably obligated by their own tangled web to bring me in front of it. If they find me, I won't pay it. If they put me in jail, I'll go on a hunger strike. I'm not doing this. And that's that. I'm not using the words that other people require me to use, especially if they're made up by radical left-wing ideologues. Now, if our society comes to some sort of consensus over the next while about how we'll solve the pronoun problem, let's call it, and that becomes part of popular parlance, and it seems to solve the problem properly without sacrificing the distinction between singular and plural, and without requiring me to memorize an impossible list of an indefinite number of pronouns, then I would be willing to reconsider my position. But I'm also partly opposed to this because it's been made mandatory and has the whole weight of the law behind it. It's like, this is a very bad idea. I believe this is a very bad idea. And I believe that the reason this has caused so much noise, tremendous amount of noise, tremendous amount of attention on YouTube, is because there are things that are at stake in this discussion, despite its surface nature, that strike at the very heart of our civilization. That's what I believe. The data is in. The experiment is done. Tens of thousands of people, multiple countries. And it's not what anyone expected. And you might think, well, it's all the right-wing psychologists. It's like, all the right-wing psychologists are in this room, sitting in this chair. Is that sufficient?
But you sort of do have certain predispositions that you're giving in the same way in which people from political correctness are trying to say this is what it means to be a woman, these are the kind of things that it is expected from a woman to do to defend herself. And it seems to me that you are making a similar claim about this is what conservative people do, and this is how they always relate to hierarchy.
Well, I don't I would say that I perhaps am doing that, but I don't see how that's the same as what the postmodernists are doing. I mean, as far as I can tell, the postmodernists aren't saying that the groups, the individuals within those groups, are characterized by any stable characteristics whatsoever, except for the fact of their comparative oppression. So I don't understand the first part of your argument. I mean, part of the reason the postmodern types have been going after me is because I've dared to say that men and women differ in temperament, which, by the way, they do. So, now, you know, that's actually something that might be worth just differentiating quickly, because it's actually technically somewhat challenging, but also very much worth knowing. I was debating someone on a panel this morning on a TV show, The Right Stuff. And this was a woman who led the Women's Equality Party. And she cited some psychological literature that purported to claim that men and women were mostly the same. And that's actually true. We are more the same than different. If you look at our temperaments, there's more overlap than there is variance by a substantial amount. And so even on the temperamental dimensions where there is most difference between men and women, the difference isn't of massive magnitude at the center of the distribution. So for example, women are less aggressive than men, which is, by the way, why they try to commit suicide more often, but are much less lethal in their actions. That's one example, but there are many examples. If you draw a random woman and a random man out of the population, the probability that the man will be more aggressive is 60%. If you bet on the man, you'd win 60% of the time. That's not a walloping difference. It's not 95% of the time. You know, it's a difference that is substantive, it's significant, it's measurable, but it's not large by the standards by which such things are judged. But that's not the point. The point is that most of the activity takes place at the extremes. So out on the tails of the distribution. So here's an example. About 9 out of 10 people in prison are male. Why? Because to be in prison, you have to be the most aggressive person, let's say in 100. Okay. Those differences at the midpoint are large enough so that if you go out to the extremes, 1 in 100 people, you have an overwhelming preponderance of men. And so you can have your cake and eat it too. You can say, well, yeah, broadly speaking, men and women are more the same than different. The overlap is greater than the disjunction. But that's not relevant if what's being selected is often at the extremes, and it often is. So for example, with regards to engineering, there's a fair bit of evidence that people who are more interested in things than in people become engineers. Now, that's not really going to be, what is that, shocking? Are you shocked by that? You shouldn't be shocked by that, right? You can tell that not only by what engineers do, but you can tell that by how they think, and you can tell that just by talking to them, if you know a bunch of engineers. So, and it turns out that the largest temperamental difference that's known between men and women is actually interest in people versus interest in things. And so it has nothing to do with competence, but it has a lot to do with interest. And because you have to be very interested in things to go be an engineer, because that's all you're going to be doing if you're an engineer, then only those people who are extremely interested in things tend to become engineers. And most of them are men. And that's why even in places like Scandinavia, where a tremendous amount of effort has been put into flattening the sociocultural landscape, and successfully, by the way, there's still a preponderance of male engineers. And there's a preponderance of female nurses. And no matter how much sociological gerrymandering goes on, those statistics have remained quite intractable over about a 15-year period. And so there are differences. They're not massive. And then you might ask, well, are those sociocultural or biological? It's like, well, that's a hard question to answer, because it depends on how much variability there is in the sociocultural landscape, because the proportion by which something is biological versus sociocultural varies with the sociocultural landscape. That's a complicated thing to digest, because you think of those things as fixed, but they're not. So, but what we have demonstrated quite clearly, and this is mainstream science, despite the fact that people don't like it, this test has already been done. So we developed a personality model that's pretty stable across cultures, purely derived from statistical processes, an atheoretical model if there ever was one, and quite an unattractive model because of that conceptually, but that's beside the point. Then we saw cross-culturally whether there were differences in the fundamental temperaments of men and women, and the answer was yes, cross-culturally, quite robust. Women are higher in the experience of anxiety and emotional pain, and they're more compassionate and agreeable. Those are the big differences, and they're differences of a magnitude that I already pointed out. Then the next question is, well, to what degree is that biological versus sociocultural? And it's complicated because that variable depends on the sociocultural landscape, but we'll put that aside. You can determine that by stacking up countries from those who have done everything they possibly can to flatten out the sociocultural landscape in relationship to gender, to those who haven't, that are still very stratified by sex. And then what you do is you look at the magnitude of the temperament differences in keeping with the variability that those countries have in terms of their sociocultural egalitarianism. And the sociocultural types, the social constructionists, their prediction is, as cultures become more egalitarian, men and women become more different, more the same, because it's environmental. That isn't what happens. Exactly the opposite happens. As you flatten out the sociocultural landscape, men and women become more different. The data is in, the experiment is done. Tens of thousands of people, multiple countries. And it's not what anyone expected. And you might think, well, it's all the right-wing psychologists. It's like, all the right-wing psychologists are in this room, sitting in this chair. And that's why the overwhelming proportion of people who are in prisons are male. Now, do you want to equalize that? What about bricklayers? They're 99% male. And we've got about 3/4 of the population now in universities in the humanities and social sciences are female.
Yeah.
Are we going to equalize that? Men work longer hours, they work more dangerous jobs, they're more likely to move, they're more likely to work outside, they're more likely to participate in jobs in the STEM fields that are scalable, they make more money for those reasons, and that's all hidden under the idea that the reason...
What do you understand by equality, Sophie? What does it mean to you?
Freedom.
Can you be more, is it equality of opportunity? Is it equal pay across the board? Is it something more than that?
I think equality is better for everyone. I
Yeah,
think,
okay.
you know, and I'm really delighted, you know, I love my job because it's an optimistic and a hopeful job, which is about creating more choices for people. I'm interested in people being able to have different choices and having equality of outcome.
Aha, well, so you're going to have choices and equality of outcome. What if people choose different things, which is what they've been doing in Scandinavia? So the Scandinavian countries have moved more towards gender equality than any other countries, and the personality differences in Scandinavia have increased rather than decreased, and the proportion of women who are choosing STEM fields has decreased rather than increased. So as cultures become more gender neutral, the number of women who choose STEM fields decreases.
What do you mean by
increasing.
STEM fields?
So science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So if you let men and women make their choices, what actually happens is that they specialize in different situations, and you don't get equality of outcome.
Could they not have been programmed to have those views from the moment we raise them and give boys Lego and construction?
No, because what happens is that as countries get more egalitarian, which means there's less programming of that sort, the differences get larger, not smaller. And the scientific data on that is clear, and most of it was generated by people who have a left-leaning bias, so you can't blame it on conservative scientists. It was a shock to everyone to find that out.
Sophie,
I think the difference between Jordan and me is that we look at evidence and we lean towards different theories. So Jordan's theory is very much evolutionary, you know, that there are inherent differences in men and women. Mine is very much more social role theory, if you like, and that men and women are taking on different roles due to the expectations that society puts on them. And it's interesting that Jordan frequently cites Scandinavian countries where they've made more, like there's nowhere in the world that women are equal, but Scandinavia has made the most progress towards shared parenting, etc. Yep. That said, it's not done yet. there's nowhere in the world where this is done yet.
But it's having the opposite effect that the gender equality types predicted. Opposite, not the same. And it isn't a theory, it's actually data driven by tens of thousands of surveys and the best scientific literature on the topic. It's not a theory, and I didn't come about it because of my political perspective. I looked at the data. What it showed was that as countries become more egalitarian, the differences between men and women grow. They don't shrink.
So what I'm interested in is data and analysis as well, and I'm particularly interested in the ones presented, such as the ones by the University of Southern California, which discovered that change towards gender equality is actually being slowed by beliefs that are legitimizing social inequalities on the basis of sex. And I'm also interested, I mean, like Jordan, I look at the data and I look at the studies, and I'm really also very much interested in studies like the analysis that was done by the American Psychological Society, which looked at 45 analysis of whether there's sex difference over 20 years. And its conclusion was that men and women are basically alike in terms of personality, in terms of cognitive ability, in terms of leadership. But what it did find was that media depictions of men and women as fundamentally different perpetuate misconceptions, as does workplace bias.
Oh God, so it's my fault.
So, no, well, you're leaving soon. It's okay.
Men and women actually are more the same than they are different. But the issue is that small differences at the population level can turn into very large differences at the extreme. So, for example, men and women are broadly similar with regards to aggression, although men tilt a little bit more towards aggression. So that if you picked a random person out of the population, male and female, and you guessed that the male was more aggressive, you'd be right 60% of the time. But if you take the 1 in 100 most aggressive people, they're all male. And that's why the overwhelming proportion of people who are in prisons are male. Now, do you want to equalize that, just out of curiosity? What about bricklayers? They're 99% male. And we've got about 3/4 of the population now in universities in the humanities and social sciences are female.
Yeah.
Are we going to equalize that? And men work longer hours. They work more dangerous jobs. They're more likely to move. They're more likely to work outside. They're more likely to participate in jobs in the STEM fields that are scalable. They make more money for those reasons. And that's all hidden under the idea that the reason that men and women make different amounts of money is because of their gender. It's a very simplistic analysis, and trying to
Michael,
address
I was just going to say, Sophie, can you come back on that?
What I'm trying to equalise is opportunity and choice.
Fine, let's equalise choice.
You agree on that.
But we won't get equal outcome that way.
And I think that what happens then, nobody knows, because we've never done it yet.
We do know. We know what's happened in Scandinavia.
But it's not fully got there yet.
No, but it's going in the opposite direction that everyone predicted, and strongly.
I think one of the things I loved about Jordan's book, which I speed read last night, so forgive me, Jordan, I've not read every line. But one of my favourite rules in Jordan's book is Rule 9, which says, assume the person you are listening to might know something you don't.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that in a country where men outnumber women by 2 to 1 in Parliament, in local government, where women's voices are not equally represented in media, where our education systems still are teaching boys and girls ideas of pink and blue. Yep. What I'm trying to do is work with thousands of optimistic, hopeful people for change.
Your boss called the gender pay gap a burning injustice. Is it?
Yes, it is, because there should be inequality of opportunity. There needs to be the same rights. But something that surprised me, that neither of you, and equality of outcome, sure, all of that. But the one thing both of you haven't mentioned is the biological difference, which unfortunately affects women's career prospects, whether we like it or not.
Well, yeah.
Babies. And that does cause a problem. If I were to take a sabbatical from a corporation for a while, it's going to set me back slightly. And it is a problem that biologically it's women who have babies, not men.
Sure, but that's why the Women's Equality Party is the only party in the UK that's got policies around shared parental leave.
She's so political.
We're the only party that has got fully costed plans for universal free childcare. One of the other things we want to do is to have a look at curriculums, to have more female role models, to encourage girls, because so long as we still see STEM as a boys' area that we're trying to get girls into, it's not going to work. We need to do the work we're doing on care, get more boys thinking about nursing, teaching, more role models for boys in schools.
And
that's the way you break it all down.
programs like EastEnders, The Archers, that's helped them a lot.
Right, so listen, I have to draw things to a conclusion. Can I just say how wonderful, 3 people, diverse political views, diverse views on many other issues, that get along famously and have wonderful conversations. Thank you. That is.
There's only 2 reasons that men and women differ. One is cultural, and the other is biological. And if you minimize the cultural differences, you maximize the biological differences. I know everyone's shocked when they hear this. This isn't shocking news. People have known this in the scientific community for at least 25 years.
Why do you think so many young men are following you? Because you have a lot of your audience.
Because I want the best for them, genuinely. I'm encouraging them.
More than you do for young women?
No, not
So why do you think so many are young men?
Oh, well, I think part of it's technological fluke. I mean, I came to prominence, at least in part, on YouTube, because I put my university lectures there, and it happens to be the case that 80% of the people who watch YouTube are young men. So there's that, and it's hard to know how to factor that in exactly. But then I think that young women are encouraged a lot, which is fine as far as I'm concerned. But I think that that's less true for young men now, because we believe that there's something pernicious about male competence and activity. It's part of I suppose it's part of the notion that the best way to characterize Western society is as a tyrannical patriarchy, which is an appalling doctrine as far as I'm concerned.
How come is that?
Well, it's not a tyrannical patriarchy. So it's not tyrannical, that's the first thing. Certainly not compared to any other governmental form that currently exists and has ever existed.
What you're doing and doing now as well is challenging the idea of gender equality. Why do you think that can be a problem, the idea of gender equality?
I don't think that equality of opportunity is a problem. I think that's a great thing, and that anyone with any sense champions equality of opportunity. I mean, even if you're purely selfish, say, and purely self-centered, you'd want to set up an economy where everyone who had ability could be maximally exploited by everyone else, because then we can all benefit from each other's talents. And so equality of opportunity is an absolutely useful fundamental principle.
So where's
but
the
that has
problem?
nothing to do with equality of outcome. Those things aren't even in the same conceptual universe. And to strive for equality of outcome is, well, it's a fool's game and likely to be it has proved to be in the past, extraordinarily dangerous, as well as impossible. The biggest differences between men and women in the world in terms of temperament and interest are in Scandinavia, and they've maximized as a consequence of your egalitarian policies.
What do you mean by that?
It means that the more egalitarian your state, the bigger the personality differences between men and women. That's like How do you measure that? How do you know that? Oh, well, psychologists have perfected, at least to some degree, the measure of personality over the last 30 years with very advanced statistical models. And so what you do is you offer men and women well-validated tests of preference and of personality. And you do that all across the world with tens of thousands of people in multi-country samples. And then you look at the difference between men and women, and then you rank order that by wealth and egalitarian social policy. And what you find is the more egalitarian the society, the more different the men and women become.
Is this something you can recognize, or is it?
I would say, for me, it's quite a simple question, actually. Do we want that our sons and daughters should have the same opportunities and the same dreams or hopes for the good thing, or no? And for me, it's simple to answer that. It's yes, of course. So for me, equality and gender equality is very, very important. For me, also when we talk about gender equality, it's important for me to learn my daughter that her mom can lead and show the way, and her dad can hug and kiss her and show feelings. And I think that's something very important for the hoods where kids grow up, to show feelings, to have these gender equality discussions, to show her a way of opportunities and to strive forward. And it's important both for lonely men, lonely young men, but also for women that feel this roof of glass they need to fight and to struggle the roof of glass to be successful in their lives.
Do you agree on this?
I think that equality of opportunity is a perfectly reasonable proposition. I mean, I have a daughter and a wife. I do everything and many female clients and who I've consulted with and helped, and in many cases helped accelerate the development of their career tremendously. It's obviously of great utility to encourage forward striving in young people and people in general. That's not the issue in the least. The issue is the outcome.
Yeah, well, then why do you think the outcome, and these countries where the outcome is more equal, why do you think that leads to bigger differences between the sexes?
Because there's only two reasons that men and women differ. One is cultural, and the other is biological. And if you minimize the cultural differences, you maximize the biological differences. So, I know everyone's shocked when they hear this. This isn't shocking news. People have known this in the scientific community for at least 25 years. And it's been replicated in the last month 3 times in 3 separate samples, including in Science, which is the world's greatest scientific magazine by a large margin. And it isn't a small effect, it's a huge effect.
But excuse me, what does it mean? Does it mean that Scandinavian men and women are having more difficulties meeting each other, talking to each other than other places?
No, not necessarily, but it does mean that there are reasons for differences in participation rates in different occupations that aren't a consequence of socialization. So, for example, this is especially true at the extremes. So, for example, on average, men are more interested in things and women are more interested in people. And that's actually the biggest difference we know of psychologically between men and women. And even though men and women are quite similar, all things considered, the extremes make a difference. So you imagine that in order to become an engineer, look, obviously not everyone becomes an engineer, you have to have a particular temperamental proclivity to become an engineer. You have to be extraordinarily interested in things rather than people. Well, most of those people are men. And if you want to become a nurse, well, then you have to be much more interested in people than you are in things. And most of those people are women. And so you get differences in occupational choice that are also, by the way, quite great in Scandinavia, especially in the case of engineering and nursing, that are mostly due to biological differences, and you cannot minimize that by social engineering. So, and it's not a bad thing. Like, look, one of the things you want to ask yourself is that what is the purpose of setting up a society that offers maximal equality of opportunity? And one of the answers is that you maximize people's free choice. And if you maximize free choice, then you also maximize differences in choice between people. And so you can't have both of those.
But of course it will have differences in choice, of course, because we are human beings. But I can't see why it differs between me and Skavlan, for instance. But of course it differs in biological things, but not in choices, because I think more how we raise them, how we live, education, a sort of culture, attitudes form a human being, whether or not they are a girl or a boy when they grow up. Mm-hmm. And if I raise my daughter to become a leader, to be self-confident, to have a high education, for instance, I think she will have a good platform to become a civil engineer, to become a CEO of a company, or to become a nurse.
Well, that is what people who think that the differences between people who are primarily culturally constructed believe, but it's not what the evidence suggests.
Okay, we don't agree on that.
Racism is a global and vague term.
Sorry, but why would you possibly do that? What did that mean?
Because I said it was a global and vague term.
The inverted commas is if it's not a real thing.
No, that isn't what it meant.
Well, what did it mean then? Explain.
It meant that it...
I know a lot of people who have staggeringly successful careers, and they're often loath to go into a political field despite the tremendous expertise they've developed, because they have to put everything that they've already accomplished on hold or in hawk, in a sense, to enter the public sphere. And I think one of the problems with that is that the most highly competent people in many fields are dissuaded from a political career because it requires the unproductive sacrifice of everything they've built. And so what that does, in some sense, is deprive us of
some of the best people who could be considering politics as a mode of public service. And so that's a complicated problem to try to solve.
Why do we assume that such people are the best people? They're obviously not
No, because
the best
they've
people for the
demonstrated
job.
extreme competence in at least one area of
That's
inquiry.
banking, that's that persona. This is why we're in the situation where we are with people like politicians that we have at the moment that are corrupt. There's no transparency, there's no accountability that you get in industry. We don't even have it in our politics at the moment.
Yeah, but that's not
because
why
of
you
this
have corruption.
attitude
No.
that what is perceived as a good leader.
No,
And
that's not
what
why
the
you have that
issue
problem.
is.
Most people who are successful in their given field aren't corrupt. It's very difficult to become successful and be corrupt.
So
I know
we're making
people
that
like to think
assumption.
that, but it's just not true.
Corruption is good, it's acceptable.
Look, 3% of the population is psychopathic, and it never really goes above that. And the reason that it never goes above that is because being psychopathic is not a very good strategy. And so the idea that people in power are corrupt, by definition, especially if they've built up their stature and influence as a consequence of competence, is simply wrong. And so you do want people who've demonstrated high levels of competence in at least one other field to serve as potential political candidates. What else would you use as a criteria for their ability? It's absolutely the case that institutions have a proclivity towards corruption under some circumstances. That's true of all institutions. But to blindly assume that that's more characteristic, let's say, of your political leaders than it is of you, for example, as a person, it's an empty sort of cynicism. It doesn't serve people well, and it's not true of reasonable governments or countries. It's simply not true.
The revelations from cricket's Azim Rafiq.
Former cricketer Azim Rafiq this morning stood before politicians ready to give his honest and powerful testimony about the racist treatment he says he was forced to endure during his time playing for Yorkshire County Cricket Club.
I felt isolated, humiliated at times, constant use of the word. In 2017 pre-season tour, we were in a place and Gary Balance walks over and goes, "Why are you talking to him? You know he's a or he's not a sheikh, he's got no oil."
And footballers still taking the knee. What does this say about racism as a continuing undercurrent in present-day Britain?
Things need to be particularized rather than generalized, as a general rule, let's say. And so this cricket player was facing racism by his own account. The question is, who, when, what, exactly? Because otherwise it degenerates into something like a discussion of structural racism. And when it becomes abstracted up to that level, first of all, that pits group against group, which I think is entirely counterproductive. And it actually doesn't address the issue. You know, racism is a global and vague term.
Sorry, but why would you possibly do that? What did that mean?
Because I said it was a global and vague term.
The inverted commas as if it's not a real thing.
No, that isn't what it meant.
Well, what did it mean then? Explain.
It meant that it's indicative of low-resolution thinking. And what I mean by that is we use all these terms frequently in discussions like this that are
He was
containers
called
of undifferentiated
He
content.
was repeatedly called abusive terms directly linked to his ethnicity.
By who?
By not just one, but repeated members of the Yorkshire Cricket Club. He's had people contact him.
then
if
they-
it walks like a duck, Jordan, talks like a duck,
I'm not
it's a duck. It's racism.
I'm not denying his experience.
Right.
What I asked was exactly who and when, and you just answered that
Yes.
question. So I would say those specific people should be held specifically to account for their actions before any movement up the abstraction hierarchy to a discussion of something like structural racism, which I don't think is helpful.
Well, he has talked about institutional racism in cricket.
Mhm.
He says that's what he's experienced as a term, institutional racism.
Right, I know. And like I said, I believe that abstracting up the problem to that level of analysis does no good because it pits groups against groups. I think it exacerbates the problem, the concept of structural racism. It's too imprecise. It doesn't address the issue. Now, that does not mean racism does not exist. That is not what I'm saying in the least.
Maybe let's do less of the hand movements and
Well, I
let's
did
look at
it
the
once,
evidence
so yes,
that there
I'll
was.
try
So
to
the evidence
control it
was
in the future.
about the experience that Azim had, about multiple accounts. I think when we talk about structural racism, one of the things that really occurs to me, if I think about it in lay men and women's terms, is the bystander effect. And what is so powerful about his testimony is not just the explicit racism that he faced, it's the numbers of people who stood by and basically normalised that behaviour. We have a problem in British society. We have a problem particularly in sport. And we also have a problem when it comes to our definitions of racism, because people tend to lump people of different minority community backgrounds together. You know,
and how do you talk about structural racism?
I'm going to need to bring up Peterson as well.
But the thing for me that I think is so powerful is this concept of the bystander, is the idea of the person who may think of themselves not as a racist, who may not have joined in this poor young man being bullied in the way that he was.
I need to mention
nothing.
Stella simply because he has talked about it himself today, Azim Rafiq, that he has apologised for some anti-Semitic tweets that he put out several years ago.
What I think is really powerful is how clear and compelling his apology is and how he's recognised it.
No. You don't get it. The devil's in the details. You work it out now when you formulate your restrictions on free speech. You don't shunt that off into the future. Who defines hate?
So wouldn't you say that the attempt to claw back or the right of freedom of speech isn't so far absolute as instrumental? And based on that, therefore, there are some cases where freedom of speech of some individuals can be curtailed if we want to get the better appreciation of the Logos and a better inclusion of more voices that are currently being shut out as a result of the extremity and radicalism of those select few. Wouldn't you say that's the case? Thank you.
Well, there's a very simple answer to that, which is yes. I'm not an admirer of hate speech laws, but that doesn't mean that I'm naive enough to think that there's no such thing as hate speech. So obviously, if you've ever been involved in an extremely serious argument, you know perfectly well that there's such a thing as hate speech, because you've probably uttered some. So there's also no doubt that there are forms of speech that are utterly reprehensible, and some of those are actually already punished by law. You can't incite to violence, you can't libel someone, right? So we have some restrictions already on what's acceptable discourse. Whether it's the case, typically speaking, that some people have more privileged access to free speech than others, well, that's obviously the case. I mean, that's part of power. And power is one of the means by which people climb hierarchies, although the more you can climb a hierarchy by exercising power, the more that's an indication of the fact that that hierarchy has become corrupt. So there's no doubt that these structural impediments to the free exchange of discourse exist. There's also no doubt, as you already laid out, that that's not in everyone's best interest, because what you want, if you have any sense in your society, and this is also why I think that we've put proper emphasis on the sovereignty of the individual, is that you want everyone's logos to have the opportunity to clarify the unknown and reconstitute the world. And if you shut that down, then you risk getting access to the unique insights that that individual might bring. Okay, so I agree with your diagnosis completely. And I think that, you know, even in the West, to ignore the fact that many of our hierarchies tilt towards tyranny and that prejudice still exists in multiple forms is a mistake, although it's only one factor among many and shouldn't be identified as the primary causal determinant of each individual's life. I think that's a dreadful error. The question is, what do you do about it? And the devil's in the details. And as I said already, I'm not an admirer, for example, of hate speech laws, even though there's plenty of hateful speech, because I think the best thing to do is to leave free speech alone as much as you possibly can. Not because that will result in the perfect conditions for free speech, but because anything else that you're likely to do is going to make it worse rather than better. You know, if you look across the world, most societies don't do a good job of either promoting or allowing free speech. I don't know how we ever managed it. It's so unlikely because it's so hard on people and hard on those who occupy positions of power in tyrannical hierarchies that I can't believe that any society's ever managed to figure it out at all. So those dangers are always there. And I also think the highest likelihood often is that societies that do put high value on free speech will lose that because it's so difficult to maintain. So, but with regards to hate speech, for example, let's say that things would be much better if there was less hateful speech. It's like, seems highly probable to me, especially if you look at the more egregious forms of hateful speech. How best to regulate it? Well, my sense is you let those who wish to utter hateful things do so and let everyone hear them, because that's the best way to ensure that what they're saying will be understood and rejected. Now, in order to posit that, you have to assume that the population composed of sovereign individuals is wiser than it is foolish.
That's a hope. You might think about it as an axiom of faith, but I do believe it to be the case. I think that if you put the evidence in front of people, by and large, they will do the right thing. I think that the problem with regulating hate speech, it's very simple. Who defines hate? And the answer to that is, over any reasonable period of time, exactly the people you would least want to have define hate. And so the consequences of the regulation become incalculably worse as a problem than the problem that they were designed to deal with. It's like, well, we have a problem, hate speech. Well, we can come up with a solution and there will be no problems with that solution. It's like, no, that isn't how the world works. You know, when I'm negotiating with my clinical clients, one of the things I always tell them is, often, because they're in difficult circumstances, and often not for psychological reasons, it's like, no, you don't understand. You're screwed both ways. You don't have an option here where you're not going to suffer. That's what it means to be in a bad situation. You're going to pay a price both ways. You can pick your price. Okay, so we're going to have hate speech, or we're going to have the consequences of the arbitrary regulation of hate speech. Well, I know what the consequences are of the arbitrary regulation of hate speech, is that things get a lot worse, because hate's very difficult to define. And that's actually a real problem when you're trying to regulate it, because you have to be able to define it. And we're already at a point where, well, you made someone uncomfortable. Why isn't that hate speech? I mean, I was basically asked that by one of your most outstanding journalists, or your most popular journalists.
Why should your right to freedom of speech trump a trans person's right not to be offended?
Because in order to be able to think, you have to risk being offensive. I mean, look at the conversation we're having right now. You know, like, you're certainly willing to risk offending me in the pursuit of truth. Why should you have the right to do that? It's been rather uncomfortable.
Well, I'm very glad I put you on the spot.
Well,
I'm very glad that I've exercised my freedom of speech.
You get my point. It's like, you're doing what you should do, which is digging a bit to see what the hell's going on.
So
and that is what you should do. But you're exercising your freedom of speech to certainly risk offending me. And that's fine. I think more power to you, as far as I'm concerned.
So you haven't sat there and... I'm just trying to work that out. I mean...
Ha, gotcha.
You have got me. I'm trying to work that through in my head.
Well, why should you have the right to say something that's offensive? It's like, we can think that through. Let's think that through for a minute. So, I mean, my riposte to her, essentially, although this wasn't directly it, was, that's not a very smart question for a journalist to be asking, right? Because of all people who should never ask that question, would be stand-up comics, right? And journalists. Because that's all they ever do. That's what it means to be a journalist, is to ask a question that's going to be offensive to someone. Who the hell wants to hear about what you've discovered unless it's about something contentious and important? So it was a jaw-dropping question as far as I was concerned. And the fact that it was a jaw-dropping question was part of the reason why that video went viral. Okay, so now let's think about offensiveness as part of hate. Okay, so the first thing we might say is that you really need to think when you have a difficult problem. And a difficult problem is one where there's something at stake. It might be your life, it might be your well-being, but and then we might say, well, there's going to be a diversity of opinions about that particular conundrum if it actually happens to be difficult. And so even to discuss it, because if you discuss it, you're going to discuss option A, it's going to annoy all the people who want option B, or you're going to discuss option B, and that's going to annoy all the people that want option A, and maybe there's 10 options. So if you're going to discuss anything of any real significance whatsoever, you're going to make people hot under the collar, and you're going to risk offending them. Okay, so what, you just stop talking about difficult things? And the answer to that is yes, and that's what's happening. But then there's another problem, which is there isn't anything I could conceivably say about anything that isn't going to offend someone if the crowd is large enough. So you might say, well, if you're talking to two people, you can't offend one of them. So you don't get to offend 50% of the population. It's like, okay, let's say I'm talking to 1,000 people, and one person finds what I'm saying offensive. Say, well, that's hateful. It's like, well, that's 1 in 1,000. So should I stop? What if it's 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 1,000,000? Like, where's the cutoff?
And you might think, well, we'll work that out. It's like, no. You don't get it. The devil's in the details. You work it out now when you formulate your restrictions on free speech. You don't shunt that off into the future so that it's a problem that'll be solved. Who defines hate? Insoluble problem. Don't regulate it, because you can't define it.
Thank you.
I don't know where he thought he was, but to come out in front of all those kids and basically tell them that the whole human enterprise is so goddamn corrupt that the best thing they could possibly do is limit their multiplication, and to think of himself as a scholar and an educator was just, I did say something, by the way. It was rather uncomfortable, and he stomped off the stage. But that's no message for young people. There's no excuse for that. And you think, well, we're going to destroy the planet. We have to do this. We have to demoralize the youth to be ethical. It's like, yeah, really, that's your theory? You're going to demoralize young people to be ethical?
Incoming freshmen next year, University of Toronto, Stanford University, 18-year-old kids coming into this. We've been through 3 years of COVID. I won't rehearse it all. One sentence. What would you say to them as they begin university at the age of 18 or 19? What's the restorative, the redemptive sentence? What should they do?
Don't be thinking your ambition is corrupt. Because that's part of the message now. Human beings, we're a cancer on the planet. We're headed for an environmental apocalypse. The entire historical structure is nothing but atrocity, etc., etc. Anyone with any ethical aim whatsoever is just going to pull back. You don't want to manifest any ambition, support the patriarchal structure, exploit the environment. You've got to crush yourself down. You shouldn't even have any children. It's like, no. There's no excuse for that.
Right here, Peterson drops a truth bomb, and you can feel the frustration bubbling under the surface. It's like he's calling out a bad coach who tells the team, we're all terrible players, so why bother showing up? Imagine being 18, full of potential, and hearing someone say, hey, your best move in life is to stop existing. That's the kind of message that deflates the human spirit faster than a balloon at a porcupine party. Sure, we need to be mindful of the environment, but telling young people to curb their ambition because humanity is inherently bad? That's like fixing a flat tire by slashing the other three. Where's the hope?
There's zero excuse for that. I saw a professor at an event, something like this. He came out and trumpeted this bloody, environmentally friendly house he built. And, fair enough, man. It was a pretty interesting house, but not everybody had the $4 million that it took him to build it. And I'm not criticizing his money even. It's like, he's had some money, good for him. He built a house, okay. But then to trumpet that as a moral virtue, well, you're pushing it there. And then he came out to all the kids and he said, my wife and I decided that we were only going to have one child. And I think that's one of the most ethical things we could have possibly done. And I would strongly encourage you to do the same. I thought, you son of a bitch. You get up in front of these young people. A lot of these kids were children of first-generation immigrants from China. And he showed all these images, of these terrible factories in China, these endless rows of sterile mechanism that were subordinating all the Chinese people to this terrible, capitalist machine. And I thought, you don't understand. Half the audience is looking at those factories and thinking, that's a hell of a lot better than struggling through the mud under Mao, buddy.
This part is where Peterson swings for the fences, and honestly, he's got a point. Context matters. Telling a room full of students, many of whom come from backgrounds where progress means moving beyond hardship, that industrialization is the enemy, can feel tone deaf. It's like giving someone a ladder out of a hole and then criticizing them for climbing too fast. Sure, the system has flaws, but for many, it's still better than the alternative. Here's a takeaway. Progress doesn't have to be perfect to be progress.
And so, I don't know where he thought he was, but to come out in front of all those kids and basically tell them that the whole human enterprise is so goddamn corrupt that the best thing they could possibly do is limit their multiplication, and to think of himself as a scholar and an educator was just, I did say something, by the way. It was rather uncomfortable, and he stomped off the stage. But that's no message for young people. There's no excuse for that. And you think, well, we're going to destroy the planet. We have to do this. We have to demoralize the youth to be ethical. It's like, yeah, really, that's your theory? You're going to demoralize young people to be ethical? That's your theory?
And now we're in the thick of it. Peterson is taking on the idea that guilt and shame are the path to ethics. It's like trying to teach someone to swim by tossing them into a stormy ocean and yelling, figure it out. You can see why this rubs him the wrong way. Young people need encouragement, not existential dread. If we tell them their only contribution to the world is less of them, we're robbing them of the drive to make things better. It's like saying, you can't fix the car because it's already a clunker. Where's the room for hope, creativity, or growth?
It's like you should go home and think about that for like a year. And I'm passionate about this, you know, because you have no idea how many people that's killing. You have no idea. I see people everywhere, all over the world. They're so demoralized, especially young people, with a conscience, because they've been told since they were little that there's nothing to them but corruption and power.
Here's where Peterson's passion really hits home. Think about the weight of growing up under a narrative that humanity is inherently corrupt. It's like trying to build a house on quicksand. No matter how hard you work, you're told it's going to sink. Imagine being a young person with big dreams, only to hear that the world doesn't need you or your ideas. Peterson is challenging this defeatist mindset and saying, hold up. What if we encouraged ambition and responsibility instead of guilt? That's not just a critique, it's a call to action.
It's like, how the hell do you expect them to react? You know, well, I shouldn't do anything then, you know?
Let's take a step back and piece this together. What's Peterson really saying here? He's not denying the challenges humanity faces. Climate change, inequality, corruption, they're real and they're serious. But his argument is that the way forward isn't through tearing down young people's ambition. Instead, it's about inspiring them to aim high, take responsibility, and believe they can make a positive impact. Think about it this way. If we want a better world, we can't create it by telling the next generation to step aside. Imagine telling someone at the start of a marathon, you're not going to win, so why bother running? It's not just demotivating, it's destructive. Instead, we need to hand them the baton and cheer them on, reminding them that their effort matters, even if the finish line feels far away. Peterson's passion here is a reminder that ambition isn't the enemy, it's the engine of progress. The message isn't to ignore the problems, but to tackle them with hope, creativity, and grit. At the end of the day, every great innovation, every social movement, every piece of progress comes from someone who believed they could make a difference. And isn't that the message we all need to hear? That no matter how big the challenges, we're not too small to rise to meet them. So let's pass that hope along, because if we don't believe in the future, who will?
That isn't what I said. Like, you're pushing it past what I said by a substantial margin. I'm a sexual conservative. I'm not in the camp of, let's grab each other under the mistletoe at the Christmas party, because what the hell? Is there sexual harassment in the workplace? Yes. Should it stop? That'd be good if it did. That'd be good. Will it? Well, not at the moment it won't, because we don't know what the rules are.
Do you think men and women can work in the workplace together?
I don't know.
Without sexual harassment?
We'll see.
We'll see. How many years will it take for men and women working in the workplace together?
More than 40.
To get a sense. More than 40?
Mm-hmm. We're new at this.
We're new at this. Absolutely.
We're completely new at it. It's only been a couple of generations. That's part of the problem, right? Is that we don't know what the rules are. Like, what? Here's a rule. How about no makeup in the workplace?
Why would that be a rule?
Why should you wear makeup in the workplace? Isn't that sexually provocative?
No.
It's not?
No.
Well, what is it then? What's the purpose of makeup?
Some people would like to just put on makeup.
Why?
I don't know why.
Why do you make your lips red? Because they turn red during sexual arousal. That's why. Why do you put rouge on your cheeks? Same reason. How about high heels? What are they for?
What about high heels?
What about them? They're there to exaggerate sexual attractiveness. That's what high heels do. They tilt your pelvis forward so your hips stick out. That's what they do. And they tighten up your calf muscles. They're a sexual display. Now, I'm not saying that people shouldn't use sexual displays in the workplace. I'm not saying that. But I am saying that that is what they're doing. And that is what they're doing.
So what is the relevance then to like sexual harassment in the workplace then if you can't make...
Well, the Maoists put everybody in uniforms to stop that sort of thing from happening. Men wear uniforms. That's the way they wear suits.
I guess I'm not seeing the sort of coherence of the thought that you're putting together then, because...
What are the rules that govern sexual interactions between men and women in the workplace?
Yes.
The answer is, we don't know. Right. So I'm throwing out some questions. How about makeup? Oh, that's okay. Is it? Why? Why is it okay?
Well, I would think that there's certain ownership over one's body that they can take without...
How about negligés?
Well, look, if you
That's
had
going too far.
If you had a workplace with negligees, I think that there would be some sort of standard idea that maybe that would be a sexualized.
Okay, so there's some line between lipstick and negligees that we don't want to cross. Okay, fair enough. Where exactly is the line?
I don't think that anyone would say that wearing makeup to the office is in some ways like sexually deviant or something like that, or that it's inviting a sort of atmosphere of sexuality within the workplace.
I would say that.
You
the
would
second
say
part, sure. It's exactly what it's doing.
Okay,
Why
so
else would you wear lipstick?
Complete the thought for me then, because that's the part that I'd like for you to do. Like, complete the thought. A woman...
I'm not saying that women shouldn't do it. And I'm also not saying that it should be banned. But I'm saying that you're absolutely naive if you don't think that that has anything to do with sexuality.
Or
Obviously
sexual
it does.
harassment? Does it have something to do with sexual harassment in the workplace?
I don't know.
Do you feel that, let's just, yes or no question, do you feel like women wearing makeup in the workplace contributes to sexual harassment in the workplace?
Sure, it contributes.
And so what should be done about that? You as a clinician who believes that there should be prescriptive ideas that don't mandate behavior, but that will guide behavior.
I don't know. I don't know what the answer to that is.
Do you feel like a serious woman who does not want sexual harassment in the workplace, do you feel like if she wears makeup in the workplace, that she is somewhat being critical?
Yeah, I do think that. I don't see how you could not think that. It's like makeup is sexual display. That's what it's for. You say, well, I want to look more attractive. It's like, what do you mean by attractive exactly?
So then what is a better outcome for you then? A workplace with no sexual harassment, where women wear uniforms and don't wear makeup, much like the Maoists, like you were saying, or a sort of freer workplace in which sexual harassment is an inevitability because women wear high heels and makeup?
Well, I don't say that sexual harassment is an inevitability because women wear high heels and makeup. I didn't say that.
Or that it is more likely?
I said that it contributes to the sexualization of the workplace.
What's the difference between more likely and that?
Okay, more likely. I'll go with that.
Yeah, more likely, right?
Sure, okay.
Okay, so which one do you prefer?
Oh, I prefer the one where people had the freedom.
And so within that, so we've gotten to that point, that people should have freedom to wear makeup, right? But that will inevitably lead to, not inevitably, that it is more likely that sexual harassment happens in the workplace.
That isn't what I said. Like, you're pushing it past what I said by a substantial margin.
Sure,
I said that we don't understand the rules that govern the interactions between men and women in the workplace, right? We don't understand the rules. And so I was pushing a limit case. That's what I was doing. I wasn't saying women shouldn't wear makeup.
No, I was
saying
never
we
saying
could
that
have
you
a
said
question
that either,
about,
though.
there should be a question raised about that. And there is often. I mean, companies have dress codes, let's say, you know, and they have a reason for that. But the fact that we got tangled up in this conversation is an indication of exactly how difficult it is to have a reasonable conversation about exactly what rules should govern the interactions between men and women in the workplace.
I would object to that a little bit, because I think the reason why this conversation has been difficult is because, like, there are certain things where you'll just punt and you'll say, I'm not saying that, and you'll try and be very hyper-specific. And now, look, there are examples of that where I feel like you were right. Like, I feel like the Kathy Newman article, or the Kathy Newman interview, I felt like a lot of that she put words in your mouth.
You're just saying that's the way it is. So
you
you're
can
saying
rely on.
women have some sort of duty.
So
You're
if you
saying
want
women
domination-
want to dominate. You're saying you've done your research.
I don't feel like I'm doing that. In fact, I've been extremely careful not to.
I'm definitely not accusing you of that.
Okay, so
I'm just saying that these sorts of conversations are difficult, not that you're making it unduly difficult, because I don't think you are.
How do we not then take the next step and say that if we want to get rid of sexual harassment in the workplace, that your belief is that women should not wear high heels or makeup in the workplace?
Oh, because there's other potential solutions. People could, you could allow for a certain amount of sexual tension and not act on it in a reprehensible manner. One of the things that's enjoyable about the interactions between men and women, even if you're married, is an element of flirtatiousness that can underscore the interaction. Okay, you don't want to get rid of that. It's too tyrannical to get rid of that. But you're playing with fire. You have to know that you're playing with fire. And so there's going to be some sexual provocativeness in the workplace, let's say, both ways. But you're playing with fire. And you need to know what the rules are. We don't know what the rules are.
Okay, how about what if I said it is okay to flirt with your coworker from time to time, but, you know, don't grab them in the privates?
Well, that seems, you know, I think we could agree that that might be a reasonable start, right? But then, of course, you still have the problem of exactly what constitutes acceptable flirting.
Do you feel like the majority of people then who are sort of in this Me Too movement right now, who have been speaking out,
yeah.
I mean, do you really think all of them are saying that you can't flirt at all? You know, or do you think most of them are saying, you just don't grab me in the privates? Because I just, as somebody who also has read about this, who's studied it quite a bit, who has followed it very intensely, it really does seem like the message is like, hey, like, you know, don't pull your robe off, don't grab me in the boobs.
No, I think it's worse than that.
You do?
Yeah, well, look at what happened with NBC. Now you're supposed to report your coworkers if you suspect them of romantic entanglements. You said, like, is it only about not being grabbed? It's like, no, it's not only about that.
If it was only about not being grabbed, would you be okay with it?
Well, I'm not in favor of people being involuntarily grabbed. I'm not in favor of sexual harassment or sexual assault, and not in the least. I already told you what I think. I'm a sexual conservative.
Sure.
I don't think people should have sex on the first date. I think they should be very careful with sex, right? So I'm not in the camp of let's grab each other under the mistletoe at the Christmas party, because what the hell? I'm not in that camp. I'm in the be bloody careful camp, and don't step out of line. And don't like have designs on your secretary when you hire her. I think that's all appalling.
Why should your right to freedom of speech trump a trans person's right not to be offended?
Because in order to be able to think, you have to risk being offensive. I mean, look at the conversation we're having right now. You know, like you're certainly willing to risk offending me in the pursuit of truth. Why should you have the right to do that? It's been rather uncomfortable.
So you haven't sat there and I'm just trying to work that out. I mean,
gotcha.
You have got me.
And that went viral. That made you very famous. Why do you think that sparked such a reaction?
Well, because I think that what I was saying was self-evidently true, but not expressed very well very often. I mean, look, most of the time when you're discussing something that needs to be discussed, everybody's actually rather upset about it. You know, if you're actually talking about something important, right? Because why talk otherwise, unless you're just shooting the breeze? But if there's an issue at hand that has to be discussed, then people are already upset and they have different viewpoints. And the offensiveness in some sense is built into that. And you know that because if you have a family, if you have a wife, if you have an intimate relationship, and you're discussing something that's difficult, the probability that you're not going to offend each other if you're actually having the conversation is zero. And so you don't have to think unless you have a problem. And if you have a problem, then when you think, you're going to offend people. And so what, are we not going to think? That seems like a bad idea.
Yeah. You're obviously not an American. We love to not think. But you know, I used to do a show called Politically Incorrect back in the 90s, and thank you. Oh, the 90s, we remember them. And so I was always asked, what is your definition of political correctness? And I had to come up with one. I said, it's the elevation of sensitivity over truth, which seems like what it still is, except it's worse than ever.
It's more like the elevation of moral posturing about sensitivity over truth. It's even worse.
Yeah. So where did it come from? How did we get to this place where we're so fragile? The safe space people.
Oh, I think that you can pretty much blame it on the universities. I think that they've pursued, especially in the humanities and in the social sciences as well, they've pursued a policy of a radical leftist policy with an overlay of postmodernism, which kind of a literary criticism approach that's produced all of this. As far as I can tell, I think you can lay a lot of it at the feet of faculties like the faculties of education. There was an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education this week that just devastated the faculties of education, taking them to task for low academic standards and for possession by ideology and for basically indoctrinating people in a cult-like manner and playing identity politics and group identity.
And no free speech. They don't seem to. There was an incident in Fresno State. I don't know if you saw this, but Barbara Bush died. Okay, some professor there tweeted something nasty.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have tweeted it. She called Barbara Bush a racist and said she raised war criminals. Okay, you know, it's.
Yeah, well, the timing.
This crowd likes it, but I mean, it's nasty, and they're considering suspending her. And here's what the president of the university said. He said this was beyond free speech. This was disrespectful. Have we lost the thread back to knowing what free speech is? Yes, it can be disrespectful. That is covered under free speech. President of Fresno, you idiot. Jesus Christ.
Yeah. Well, and you see this too. I think where it's manifesting itself in a particularly appalling manner is in the increasing unwillingness of comedians, for example, to go on university campuses to be funny. And when comedians
I'm
start...
one of them.
Yeah, well, exactly.
Yeah, them. I'm not gonna... I call these people emotional hemophiliacs. You know, it's like the least little thing will make them start to bleed. But it makes me out because their answer is not to go into a room full of sharp objects. The answer is to make all of us wear bubble wrap.
Yeah, right.
So nothing we ever do makes them have a moment of discomfort.
Well,
It's
there's
really
also
very narcissistic.
Well, there's also this idea that's promoted by the people who are protecting those who are easily offended, that the way to make people secure is to protect them from things that they don't want to encounter. And there isn't a clinician, like I'm a trained clinical psychologist, and there isn't a clinician in the country who's worth his or her salt that would ever make that claim. First of all, it's hard to make people safe because life is seriously not safe.
Yes.
And the way that you make people resilient is by exposing them to things that they're afraid of and that make them uncomfortable voluntarily, but you use exposure.
Right.
And and so, like, if you over-coddle people, if you protect them from everything that's sharp, you make them dull and stupid and narcissistic, and it's a really bad idea.
So you do know America. One thing I mean, your book is fantastic, and one of the rules that I really love is you say, don't let your kids do anything that would make you not like them. That's what I've been thinking for years when I call them the you mom generation. When I see kids, never in life because I never go near a child, but like on TV and movies, I see kids like saying you mom. And I'm like, if somebody who wasn't your child did that, you'd be immensely offended, whereas the parents just take it. What's up with that?
Well, people don't like to admit that they can dislike their children or children in general, and right. But they can.
No, they totally can.
One of the things you see very commonly as a clinical psychologist is family members who hate each other, and who it's like they have their hands around each other's necks for 20 years and are squeezing very slowly, trying to strangle each other. And you see parents who clearly detest their children and have ever since they were born. And part of that, I know it's a terrible way of looking at things, but it's true.
It's so true.
And one of the things...
No, parents confide that in me because I don't have kids.
Yeah, well,
no.
That makes it safe.
They do.
But
but they say things like, yeah, I love my kids, but if I had to do it over again, I wouldn't.
Yeah, well, okay.
Like, well, don't tell the kid that.
Well, but that's so bad. Look,
it is so bad.
So bad because the thing is about little kids is that little kids have a wonderful element to them. And most people spontaneously like little kids, they'll give them a chance. And if you have little kids, one of the things that's so wonderful about it is that when you bring them out into the world, even people who aren't in good shape, rough people, and who maybe don't have much patience for humanity, it brings out the best in them, you know? And so people are willing to give your kids a chance. But then if they misbehave, especially if they're rude and they don't have any respect and they're whiny and they don't know how to listen, then people don't like your kids and you don't. And then your kids go out into a world where no one likes them. And that's what you do to your kids if you don't like them, is you send them out into that world.
But how did parents get so whipped?
Well, I think parents are afraid of exercising authority because they tend to think that authority will crush the creative spirit of their child.
Oh,
that is the idea that there are no biological differences between men and women. It's the sort of thing you hear that, it just makes your jaw drop. So if the fundamentalist Christians say, well, if homosexuality is nothing but a sociocultural construct, then why do we have to put up with it? Wrong. Now, I got in trouble for saying that because what people claimed was that I was denying the existence of people who don't fit neatly into the gendered categories, which I wasn't doing at all. The campuses are overrun in large part with disciplines that have, in my estimation, no valid reason to exist. I think disciplines like women's studies should be defunded. Any of the activist disciplines whose primary role
is the overthrow of, for example, of the patriarchy, which is about as ill-defined a concept as you could possibly formulate, that it's enough, that we've done enough public funding of that sort of thing. We're providing full-time, destructive employment for people who are doing nothing but causing trouble. I think they should be defunded because what they promote has zero intellectual credibility. Their research methods don't qualify as research methods. Their publications, 80% of humanities publications now garner 0 citations. That's not very many citations. And it's so, and the little trick, as far as I can tell, is what happens is that people write something that no one will read. They know perfectly well that no one will read it. They circulate it around their tiny group of compatriots who occupy the same little area on the intellectual spectrum. So then it's peer reviewed. Then it's published by major journals who sell it at inflated prices to libraries who squirreled away to and only increase the noise to signal ratio in relationship to the sum total of human knowledge. It's a scam from top to bottom. Here's one of the things that really bothered me about what was going on in Ontario, and this is happening everywhere, and I made this claim when I made my first video, since we have to get into this. So the technical claim in the Ontario legislation now, and this has already happened in New York, by the way. This is not only a Canadian thing. It's happening in Australia. It's happening in New Zealand. It's happening everywhere. Here's the claim. There's biological sex, there's gender identity, there's gender expression, and there's sexual proclivity, and they vary independently. That's not true. Not a bit of that is true. The correlation between biological sex and gender identity exceeds 0.99. It's virtually perfect. It's the very definition of non-independent. So you think almost everyone who's biologically male identifies as biologically male. Almost everyone who identifies as biologically male dresses and acts male. That's the gender identity element. And almost everybody who is biologically male, who identifies as male, who dresses as male, is in fact heterosexual. Those things are incredibly tightly linked, but the technical claim in the legislation is that they vary independently. Wrong. Now, I got in trouble for saying that because what people claimed was that I was denying the existence of people who don't fit neatly into the gendered categories, which I wasn't doing at all.
0.01 or whatever the percentage may be, that wouldn't fall neatly under that correlation. So certainly if there were a perfect correlation, that would work. But if there's not, it would seem perhaps that you're excluding certain people. Right? So if most people tend to identify a certain way, but there is that 0.01 that's not.
I was never denying their existence. Okay. I was denying the validity of the claim that those 4 levels of analysis existed independently of one another, which they don't. It's a false claim, and the reason that the radical social constructionists who are pursuing this line of reasoning, which is completely discredited as far as I'm concerned, I don't think it's any better than claiming that the world is flat. The reason that they're pursuing it legally is because they know perfectly well that they've lost the scientific discussion. I mean, I debated someone on Canadian public television who had the gall to say that the scientific consensus over the last 4 decades was that there was no biological differences between men and women. I mean, and that was one of the things that was so absolutely absurd about that, and there were many things that were absurd about it, was that I was in trouble with the university at that point, and he wasn't. It's like, first of all, that is not the scientific consensus of the last 4 decades. And the idea that there are no biological differences between men and women, it's the sort of thing you hear that, it just makes your jaw drop. Now, what you could say is that if you took all the dimensions along which men and women vary, and there's a substantial number of them, that there's substantial overlap between men and women on almost all of the dimensions. Now, that's not particularly true with chromosomal identity, although there are some exceptions. Like with personality, for example, and I happen to be somewhat of an expert on personality, there are marked differences between men and women, but the overlap exceeds the differences. So, for example, women are higher in agreeableness, and you might say, well, that's socioculturally constructed, but it turns out that it isn't, because if you look across cultures, and you look at the cultures that have moved most forward with gender equality provisions at the social and political levels, and that would be the Scandinavian countries, the differences in personality between men and women maximize in those countries. And these aren't tiny studies. These are studies that involve tens of thousands of people and that have been well replicated by a series of independent researchers. And so if you add the personality differences between men and women across all the personality traits, you can almost perfectly segregate men from women. And that has nothing, that doesn't take into account the obvious things like arm angle and hip width compared to waist width, and shoulder width and upper body strength and height and weight. And
the biochemical differences. And I mean, it's so preposterous that it's beyond conception to me that we're actually even discussing it. But I was making a specific claim, which is the law says these 4 levels of analysis vary independently. The only reason they're associated with one another is for cultural reasons. No, wrong. And you don't get to put fallacious scientific truths into the law. Or if you're going to do that, then I'm not going to abide by that particular law. I'm going to object to it, which is exactly what I should be doing. The law, as it's currently formulated, doesn't, in fact, it undermines the protection that these sorts of groups have been pursuing and seeking for years. So let's accept the proposition that these vary independently, or that they're only socio-culturally constructed. Okay, so where does that leave your discussion of homosexuality? So if the fundamentalist Christians say, well, if homosexuality is nothing but a socio-cultural construct, then why do we have to put up with it? It's a perfectly valid argument. You say, well, no, people are born into their sexual proclivity. Now, I'm not saying that they are or not, because I'm not making either of those cases. What I am pointing out is that the legislation and policies of that sort, as currently formulated, actually undermine the very arguments that many of the activist groups have been using to promote the fact that they're deserving of their non-standard identity, that the non-standard identity is justifiable. If your sexual proclivity is nothing but a whim, then why should I put up with it? So, and I'm not willing in the slightest to presume that just because activist groups with this postmodern neo-Marxist ethic stand up and say, well, we're on the side of the oppressed, that makes them A, on the side of the oppressed, or B, virtuous. I don't buy either of those arguments. I don't think they stand for what they say they stand for. I don't think they're promoting a doctrine that's going to do what they claim it will do. I don't believe that they're good and the rest of the world bad. I don't buy their oppressor-victim dichotomy. I don't admire their philosophical position. I think they don't know anything about history, or if they do know anything about history, then they're malevolent for pursuing exactly the same policies that led us into terrible situations before.
And the only thing that wokeness has to offer in exchange is to brainwash bright young minds like you to believe that you are victims, to believe that you have no agency, to believe that what you must do to improve the world is to complain, is to protest, is to throw soup on paintings. I am so tired of talking about woke culture. That's why it's gone too far, more than anything else. And I thank the other speakers for making the points for me, because it means I don't have to reiterate the point that no, free speech is not some right-wing reframing of whatever. It's the foundation of Western civilization. Upon this civilization is built, and the Enlightenment values that led to it. I don't have to make the point that has been made by far better people in the past, that the only way to deal with the problem of racism is to treat people on the content of their character and nothing else. And the fact that woke culture seeks to overturn that is a new form of racism that we must all oppose. It means also I will not use this opportunity to say I told you so, as someone who spent the last 5 years warning people in the West that if we continue to erode our culture, if we continue to undermine our confidence in Western values, that our enemies like Vladimir Putin will seek to capitalize on it. I will not make any of those points tonight. I want to talk to those of you who are woke and who are open to rational argument. A small minority, I accept. Because one of the tenets of wokeness is, of course, that your feelings matter more than the truth. But I believe in you. I believe there are those of you here who are woke, who are open to rational argument, so let me make one. We are told that your generation cares more than any other about one issue in particular, and that issue is climate change. We're told that many of you suffer from climate anxiety. You wish to save the planet. And for tonight, and tonight only, I will join you. I will join you in worshipping at the feet of Saint Greta of climate change. Let us all accept right here, right now, that we are living through a climate emergency and our stocks of polar bears are running extremely low. I join you in this view. I truly do. Now, what are we to do about this huge problem facing humanity? What can we in Britain do? We can only do one thing. You know why? This country is responsible for 2% of global carbon emissions, which means that if Britain was to sink into the sea right now, it would make absolutely no difference to the issue of climate change. You know why? Because the future of the climate is going to be decided in Asia and in Latin America by poor people who couldn't give a shit about saving the planet. No, thank you. No, thank you. It's going to be decided by poor people in Asia and Latin America who don't care about saving the planet. You know why? Because they're poor. Because they're poor. I come from Russia, which is not a poor country, it's a middle-income country. 20% of households in Russia do not have an indoor toilet. What they have is an outdoor toilet. And I don't mean one of those nice portaloos that we get here. I don't even mean a Glastonbury portaloo. I mean a wooden shack with a hole in the ground that holds a collected fermented memory of the last 10,000 visits. How many of you are going to go home tonight and say, let's rip out our bathroom and erect a Siberian shithouse in the back garden? And if you're not, why should they? 120 million people in China do not have enough food. I don't mean that they don't get dessert. I mean they suffer from malnutrition. That means that their immune system is breaking down because they don't have enough food. You're not going to get them to stay poor. Imagine you're Xi Jinping, the leader of China. When you were 10 years old, there was a revolution, a cultural revolution in your country, and people came and they put your father in prison. Your mother had to denounce him. Your sister killed herself. And you, no longer enjoying the protection of your formerly powerful father, were sent to a village where you lived in a cave house. And here you are, decades later. You have clawed your way up the bloody and greasy pole of Chinese politics to be the undisputed supreme leader of the very Communist Party that destroyed your family. And you know that the main thing you have to do to survive and to stay in power is to deliver the one thing that the people of China want: prosperity, economic growth. Where do you think climate change ranks on Xi Jinping's list of priorities? 1/3 of all children who live in extreme poverty in the world live in India. That means they are starving and dying of preventable disease. Now, about 15 months ago, my wife got pregnant. Not me, because we're old school. And for 9 months, we talked about what our boy would look like, what he might do when he grows up. We looked at baby scans and videos on YouTube about what the fetus looks like at 9 months and 12 months and 20 months. And eventually he was born. And he is this cute little bundle of joy. He's cuter than about 80% of puppies. Right. Now, if you said to me that I had a choice, either my son had a serious risk of starving or dying from a preventable disease in the next year, or I could press a button and he would live. He would go to school. He would bring his first girlfriend home. He'd go to university and graduate and become a woke idiot. And then he'd get a job and get married and have children and become a man. But all I have to do is press this button. And for every day of my son's life, a giant plume of CO2 is going to get released into the atmosphere. Now, you're all very young, and most of you are not parents. Let me tell you something. There is not a parent in the world who would not smash that button so hard their hand bled. You are not going to get these people to stay poor. You're not even going to get them to not want to be richer. And so, I put it to you, ladies and gentlemen, there is only one thing we can do in this country to stop climate change. And that is to make scientific and technological breakthroughs that will create the clean energy that is not only clean, but also cheap. And the only thing that wokeness has to offer in exchange is to brainwash bright young minds like you to believe that you are victims, to believe that you have no agency, to believe that what you must do to improve the world is to complain, is to protest, is to throw soup on paintings. And we on this side of the House are not on this side of the House because we do not wish to improve the world. We sit on this side of the House because we know that the way to improve the world is to work, is to create, it is to build. And the problem with woke culture is that it's trained too many young minds like yours to forget about that. Thank you very much.
Now, you know, obviously in the confines of the marriage, that's a terrible thing, but...
That's a very uncomfortable subject, though, for women in particular.
Well, it's an uncomfortable subject for everyone.
Right.
So you're a young man, and all the women are rejecting you. Who's got the problem? It's not all the women. That's a bad road to go down. If all the women are rejecting you, it's you.
We both agree on this, but why is enforced monogamy the solution for people that are involuntary celibates?
Well, it's the solution to the relationship between men and women. Fundamentally, is monogamous social norms.
But these men are unattractive. If these men are
the
unattractive,
solution to them.
But if these men are unattractive to women, I don't mean just physically unattractive. I mean women aren't seeking them as mates. They need to become men.
Yes, they certainly do.
That's
That's
what
the
it is.
solution.
That's the solution.
Absolutely,
and we
man.
both agree on this. So,
yes, but they need to do that in a society where monogamy is the social norm.
But isn't
That's
it
all.
the social norm anyway? I don't think they're related, quite honestly. I don't think that involuntary celibates, I don't think that having enforced monogamy as a part of our cultural norm is going to help those people. I really don't.
It does.
How's it going to help them?
Well, because what happens is if a polygamous society develops, which is the alternative, then a small minority of men get all the women. That's what happens.
Oh, okay, I
And
could
so
see
that's
that.
all. That's the only point that I was making.
In this theoretical world where polygamous societies exist en masse, and then you do have this problem where there's a small group of men that are f***ing all the women. But that's not what we're talking
And
about.
also making the women unhappy, right? Because the women don't have any access to a genuine, intimate, one-to-one relationship over any long period of time.
Which
so it
is
doesn't
what
work
the women
well.
want. It's the whole
And-
idea is
and
that
what's best
the
for
women
kids,
want
too.
that. Right, sure, if you have children.
Right.
But I still don't think that is why these men are involuntary celibates. And I don't think it's the solution to that. I think the solution is that they need to become attractive to women.
Yes, that is the solution.
Yes.
There's no doubt about that.
I don't think the two are related.
Well, I was making a minor point. The minor point was that one of the ways that societies around the world have figured out that you keep young male aggression under control is by enforcing monogamous standards, because it gives everyone a chance in some sense. So that's the only
gives
point
everyone
that I
a
was
chance,
making.
meaning it clears more women will be available for one-on-one relationships rather than one guy who is some, whatever, for whatever reason,
Yeah, well, you see
large
this
figure in society.
Yeah, well, you see this happening in universities where women outnumber men. So the men hypothetically have more sexual opportunity, but that isn't what happens. What happens is that a small minority of men have all the sexual opportunity. A fairly large minority of men don't. The women are unhappy because they can't find a committed relationship. It's bad for most of the men, and the men who have all the sexual opportunity get cynical.
But isn't this in some ways against your whole idea of equality of outcome? Because you're talking about equality of sexual outcome now. That's a dominant basketball player that just kicks everyone's ass. This is a guy who's succeeded at the highest level, right? Well, there's going to be people like that sexually. There's going to be people that are better at finding mates, and this is what they enjoy. They enjoy having many mates.
Yep,
they
short
enjoy
term.
being, yes, but if this is what they enjoy, if it's a man who doesn't want a family and enjoys dating multiple women, why is that bad?
Well, I think the fundamental reason it's bad is because it's bad in the long run for children.
It's bad for children if
Yeah.
he chooses to have children.
Yeah, well,
that
that's
makes
it.
sense.
But that's it. That's the fundamental issue as far as I'm concerned. The problem with hierarchies is that they can get too steep and destabilize everything.
Right.
That does happen. That particularly happens in the sexual domain. And there's plenty of anthropological evidence for that. But you still might say, well, who cares? Because the men who are winning should be allowed to win and the women should be allowed to choose. It's
Right.
like, yes, except that there's the problem of children. And so society steps in on behalf of the children. And you can say, well, lots of people don't want to have children. And yes, and that's truer now than it used to be, although many of those people end up having children anyways, the guys who are sleeping
Yes.
around all the time, so that doesn't circumvent the problem. But the issue here for me isn't the men or the women, it's the children. We're trying to set up societies where the probability that children will be raised in something approximated an optimal environment is optimized. And that's going to mean sacrifice of opportunity and choice on the part of adults. It's necessary.
I agree with you, but I think that what we're talking about mirrors what we're talking about in sports. It mirrors what we're talking about in business. It's everything else. There's going to be people that are better at all different aspects of life. There's going to be people that are talented in terms of like getting women to like them.
Yes, that's true. Well, that's why also, look, you see this.
Right.
Women are hypergamous, which means they mate across and up dominance hierarchies. And so if you're a male who's successful in a given hierarchy, the probability that you're going to have additional mating opportunities is exceptionally high. It's an unbelievably good predictor of that.
That hypergamy is a very uncomfortable discussion.
Yes, it certainly is.
It's
It doesn't
very
matter.
uncomfortable.
Well, there's plenty of uncomfortable discussions to be had.
That's a big one, though.
It is.
The idea that it defines women's sexual choices by the fact that they want bigger, better. They want someone who's more successful, someone who's higher on the social ladder than what they're accustomed to or what they have.
Yeah, well,
now.
what women do is, like, mate choice is a very difficult problem. So how do you solve it? Well, here's how women solve it. Throw them in a ring, let them compete at whatever they're competing at, assume that the man who wins is the best man, marry him.
Yes.
It's a brilliant solution. It's a market-oriented solution. It's actually the solution that appears to have driven our evolutionary departure from chimpanzees.
It's a biological solution.
It's a biological solution, but it has a cost.
What is the cost?
Well, the cost is polygamy.
Is a polyamorous society just as unattainable as this utopian Marxist idea?
Yes, I think so, because societies tilt towards monogamy across the world. It's human universal. Now, that doesn't mean that people don't have polygamous or polyamorous tendencies, because they certainly do. And it's certainly also the case that one of the ways that women gerrymander this system is that, say you're married and you have children with your husband, but you also have an affair. So you have a child by another man. That's more common than anyone suspected. So part of the way that women solve the problem that you're just describing, and I'm not saying anything for this or against this, this is a purely factual biological claim, is they pick a monogamous marriage and they cheat with high status guys. Now, you know, obviously in the confines of the marriage, that's a terrible thing, but...
That's a very uncomfortable subject, though, for women in particular.
Well, it's an uncomfortable subject for everyone.
Right, but
it's a terribly uncomfortable subject.
They don't like the idea that this is a common thing, that women choose a safe man that is willing to be monogamous with them, and perhaps maybe they're above him in a social class or in sexually, and then they'll cheat with someone who is above
well,
them.
it's common, but it's not the norm. Right, it's still the norm not to do that. The norm is fidelity.
Right.
But there's plenty of exceptions.
And this is enforced monogamy, culturally, the norm. This is the very definition
Well,
of
enforced
it.
monogamy is this. It's like, okay, so my son's getting married in September. And so let's say he comes to me in a year and he says, hey, Dad, guess what? I've had 3 affairs in the last year and they've all been successful. I haven't got caught. Aren't I a good guy? What am I going to say to that? No. What the hell are you doing? That's not what you're supposed to be doing. That's enforced monogamy.
Enforced monogamy meaning the people around you try to guide them in a way that you think is going to lead to a harmonious family life.
It's built deep into the cultural norms, and if that starts to destabilize, then there's trouble. And that doesn't mean that it's not prone to all the problems that you laid out. Look, there isn't a bigger problem than successful reproduction. It is the big problem. And all of the solutions that we've generated for it are full of flaws.
That's another thing. You can have a kid and not be a present mother, still be CEO of a company, traveling the world, doing all this stuff, and have a nanny raising your child.
Right.
Like,
No, nobody wants that. But that's another
no, there are
priority.
people that do want that.
Without fail, I got to tell you, without fail, I've watched women go through their professional careers, many, many of them. It's a very rare woman who at the age of 30 doesn't consider having a child her primary desire. Their women are very good in high school, then they go to college, they're very good in college. They nail their damn grades, they do their studying, they get their A's and they ace their LSAT, so they're smart too. Then they go off to do their articling and they're really, really good at it. And then they get offered an associate position and they're really, really good at it. And then by the time they're 30, they make partner. And let's say they're in high pressure, high paying jobs. $250,000 a year, $300,000 a year, $500 an hour. Okay, what's your life like? You work all the time, period. 70 hours a week, 75 hours a week,
flat out, and you don't get to make any mistakes. And if your client calls you at 3 in the morning on Sunday, you say, I'm really glad to hear from you, because if you don't, there's some hot law firm in New York that'll take your client from you at a moment's notice. And the client is paying you, whatever, the firm, $750 an hour, of which maybe you get $350, and what they want is an answer about something really complicated right bloody now. And you can say all you want about the fact that women have a difficult time with that because it's a male-dominant patriarchy. Any female lawyer who's hit 30 and is a partner that has any sense at all knows that's complete bloody rubbish. It's market determined right to the core. What happens to the women when they're in their 30s? They all leave the high-end law firms. Why? Because who in their right mind would want to live like that? That's the issue, right? Once you make about $60,000 a year for your family, but let's say for you personally, additional income has zero impact on your quality of life. Zero. So why work 80 hours a week? Well, men will do it. Some men, very few. A handful of hyper-competitive men who are obsessed with hitting the pinnacle of the given dominance hierarchy they're in will happily work 80 hours a week, and they'll forego everything else. Relationships, family, children, way in the second category. And so those men are often very difficult to live with too, because they're so obsessed with their career. It's hard to have a relationship with them. And maybe they don't have much of a relationship with their kids, but they're damn good at what they do. And part of that is they're smart and disciplined, and they'll work non-stop all the time. It's like an obsession. And that's the sort of people who run things. Those are the people who run things. Well, they're often also disagreeable too, because you want to manage people? Really? They're not going to like you. You know, and it's not an easy thing to not be liked. And actually, if you're an agreeable person, and women are more agreeable than men, it's quite painful to be disliked. But if you're in a managerial and executive position, the probability that people are going to like you is quite low. Now, if you're a real son of a bitch, then they're going to dislike you more. But those positions are very stressful, partly because of the interpersonal dynamics, and they're also incredibly, incredibly competitive. So the women hit that at 30 and they're completely qualified, and the law firms are bloody desperate to keep them, because it's really hard to find highly qualified people, especially once you've put all that time into training them, especially if they're also good at bringing in business. The law firms trip over themselves to try to keep them. They can't. The women think, why in the world am I doing this? Why in the world would anyone in their right mind do this? Especially because they're often married by that point too, and generally they've married a husband who makes as much money or more than them. So they don't need the damn money. And so they think, well, there's more to life than this, which is exactly the right thing to think. And so they go and find a job that's 9 to 5 and controllable, so that they can hire a nanny and have some kids and have a life. And it's like, yes, that's the intelligent thing to do. So we've got things backwards in our culture. We're thinking, at least in part, why aren't there more women in positions of power? Wrong question. The right question is, why are there any men at all who want those positions of power? Because it's not just positions of power. You have to be such a knothead to think that. Oh, it's a position of power. It's like, sure, but it's a position of overwhelming responsibility. And if you make mistakes, you're done. Right? It's not like you occupy that position of power and everyone does what they're told all the time and your life is easy. It's like, forget about that. People are on your case to do exactly the right thing all the time, 100% of the time. And maybe you want that, and maybe you don't. So I don't know what people think is these people are all sitting in their offices with their feet up on the desk, smoking cigars and oppressing the world. It's like, that isn't how it works. Those people, they work flat out all the time. So, and it's fine if that's what you want, and some people are like that. They're hyper-industrious people, right, from a trait perspective, no matter where you put them. If you put them in a forest with an axe, they just wander around chopping down trees non-stop, right? Because it's built into them. But if you want to have a balanced life, and you should want that, you know, because the other thing you'll find, and this is God's gospel truth, is that the older you get, if you have any sense at all, the more important your family is to you. Like the utility of your career, maybe that peaks around 35 or 40, and it starts to decline pretty rapidly after that. And what happens, if you're fortunate, you have someone in your life that you love, that you've woven yourself together with, and you have some kids so that you have something to do from the time you're 50 till the time you're 80. And so it's a real mistake. It's a barren future without children, man, I can tell you that. It's a real mistake. And so we do a terrible job of
say, putting that image forward and saying, well, yeah, now, you know, because women have access to the birth control pill now and can compete in the same domains as men, roughly speaking, there is a real practical problem here. It's partly an economic problem now, because when I was roughly your age, it was still possible for a one-income family to exist. Well, you know that wages have been flat, except in the upper 1% since 1973. Why? Well, it's easy. What happens when you double the labor force? What happens? You have the value of labor. So now we're in a situation where it takes 2 people to make as much as 1 did before. So we went from a situation where women's career opportunities were relatively limited to where they were relatively unlimited and there were 2 incomes, to where, and so women could work, to a situation where women have to work and they only make half as much as they would have otherwise. And now we're going to go into a situation, this is the next step, whereas women will work because men won't. And that's what's coming now. So there was an economist article showing that 50% now of boys in school are having trouble with their basic subjects. And you look around you in universities, you can see this happening. I've watched it over decades. I would say 90% of the people in my personality class are now women. There won't be a damn man left in university in 10 years, except in the STEM fields. And it's a complete bloody catastrophe. And it's a catastrophe for women, because I don't know where the hell you're going to find someone to have a, you know, to marry and have a family with if this keeps happening. So, and you think when you're 19, because you're so clueless when you're 19, you don't know a bloody thing, you think, well, I'm not really sure I want children anyways. It's like, oh yeah, you tell how well you've been educated. Jesus, dismal. Without fail, I got to tell you, without fail, I've watched women go through their professional careers, many, many of them. It's a very rare woman who at the age of 30 doesn't consider having a child her primary desire. And the ones that don't consider that, generally, in my observation, there's something that isn't quite right in the way that they're constituted or looking at the world. Sometimes you get women who are truly non-maternal, you know, by temperament. They have a masculine temperament, disagreeable, they're not particularly compassionate, they're not maternal, they're not that interested in kids. Fair enough, man, but there aren't that many of them, and there's plenty who will not admit to themselves that that's what they most desperately want.
Can you please elaborate on why you advise against cohabitation before marriage?
Well, the simple answer to that question is there's plenty of evidence that it's a bad idea. And I just mean factual evidence to begin with, although I think there are other reasons. People who live together and then get married are more likely to get divorced, not less likely. And that's a really interesting fact, because it flies in the face of what you might think of as a kind of pragmatic common sense, you know, because you might think, well, you don't buy a car without taking it out for a test drive. Right, and everyone laughs because that seems obvious, but then, you know, a woman's not a car. And neither is a man, and really, like seriously, really not an object. What the facts reveal is that if the goal is to learn what you need to learn so that you can decide who you should marry more effectively, or learn how to act if you do get married more effectively, and the goal is that your marriage will be better and last, then it doesn't work. And that's a strange truth. And then you might ask yourself, well, why? Why doesn't it work? It's also the case, by the way, that the more sexual partners, the larger the number of sexual partners that someone has had before they get married, the more likely they are to get divorced as well. I thought about this, or philosophically, I thought about what are you telling someone when you live with them? Okay, so I've talked to lots of people, women who are cohabiting with men are generally not very happy about the fact that the relationship is not moving towards marriage. Now, I think there's a bunch of reasons for that. Women seem to suffer more emotionally as a consequence of sexual activity outside of a committed relationship. You can imagine why that is. Women experience more negative emotion than men on average in general, but also women pay a much higher, sex is much riskier for women than it is for men, obviously. Hopefully I don't have to explain why that is. And so women are often women who are cohabiting are often less than happy about that, and the men who I've talked to about that about their partner's displeasure with the current unstable nature of the relationship, often say something like, well, we don't need a piece of paper to indicate our commitment to each other, which sounds all revolutionary and Che Guevara, but which is really a pretty pathetic bit of reasoning. First of all, for someone to say that means they think that what they just said convinces you that all marriage is a piece of paper, and that's a preposterously foolish argument. I mean, at minimum, in the typical marriage ceremony, you make a vow by whatever is holy to you, or at least in front of the state itself, and then in front of your community as you define it, that you're going to make a commitment to someone. And if you think that's nothing, then you're probably the sort of person that the person you asked to marry you should run away from. So that's pretty shallow. And then you might ask, well, why do you need to commit to your partner in front of your community and a higher authority, let's say? And the answer is, well, life is really, really difficult, and you're going to have a rough time with your partner no matter how much you love them, because the two of you are different, and you're different sexually, and you're different temperamentally, and so you're not going to see eye to eye all the time, and then horribly difficult things are going to come your way, and the complexity of those difficult things is going to tempt you to pull apart. And exactly when pulling apart might be the worst possible thing for you, and maybe you need that vow before your community and God himself, let's say, or at least the state, and the vow that you've made to yourself and your partner, and the vow that you've made publicly to all your friends to keep you together when the going gets rough. And you might say, well, you don't need that. And I would say, well, that's just because the going hasn't got rough enough for you yet, because when it does get that rough, you'll bloody well know that you needed that. That's for sure. That will definitely happen to you if you marry someone, because all the things that life can throw at you will be thrown at you in the course of a marriage. So next, what are you telling your partner? Well, as far as I can tell, if you live with someone, here's what you're saying to each other. You're the best I can manage at the moment. And maybe the same applies to me for you. And we both really don't want to take on any more responsibility than necessary. Plus, we both want to have the option of trading up if opportunity comes along. And so why don't we just make do with this provisional arrangement while we cast our eye out into the broader world and see if we can fish something better in. And, you know, you can say I'm cynical about that, but I don't think I'm cynical about that, because living together means something like, well, we're not permanently committed, and not permanently committed means, well, we're impermanently committed, and impermanently committed means we're looking for a better commitment. Or perhaps to be alone, but forget that, because that's usually not true. Well, what kind of basis is that to have a relationship with someone? How are you going to found a relationship on that? Especially an intimate relationship. How's that going to work? It's like, you'll do for now. I don't think that's a very solid foundation to allow you to move forward. And then it's indeterminate too. It's, well, if you're just living together, do you have kids? Because that's a commitment, that's for sure. And that's a real commitment, or it better be, and it's going to be inevitably anyways. And so if there's ambiguity about your commitment to each other, there's going to be ambiguity about your plans for children, and that's a huge ambiguity in most relationships, and so that's not helpful. That just means neither of you know what the hell you're doing, and that provokes anxiety and uncertainty, and it decreases hope, because hope is experienced in relationship to a goal, and if the goal is ambiguous, maybe we'll have kids and maybe we'll not, well then there's no real hope there. And so that seems to be a pretty decent pathway to misery. And then the next issue is, you're not married if you're living together. And so you might say, well, you're practicing being married. It's like, no, you're not. Why? Because it's not something you can simulate. So one of the things I learned from reading Carl Jung thought about marriage as a container, as a container for alchemical transformation, as a container that would produce a heat so intense that the base metal of your psyche could be transformed into something ideal. But it had to be a container that could take heat, because it requires heat to transform. And you might say, well, how much heat does someone as base as you need to transform? And the answer might be, a lot of heat. I need a lot of heat and pressure before I'm going to change, before I'm going to become purified in any real sense. And so what's the heat and pressure? Here's what it is. You don't get to run away. You're stuck with that person. And they're stuck with you. And you made a vow. It's like, uh-oh, I'm stuck with you. Just like I'm stuck with me. And the vow is exactly that, right? In some real sense. The vow is, I'm going to treat you like you're me. And you don't even like yourself very much, so that's a vicious vow. And so you might say, well, how desperate do you have to be when confronted by someone else to change your ways? And the answer might be, well, you have to be as desperate as being shackled to someone makes you. You know, one of the reasons that Tammy and I have got along and are still together is because we both know that we're stuck with each other. And so we decided quite a long time ago that we didn't want to have the same stupid fight every day for the next 40 years. That's hell. And so the alternative is, now let's just have a bloody fight right here and now and see if we can sort out whatever the hell is so stupid about us that's keeping us in this dismal hell. And why? Well, because otherwise we're just stuck with this misery. And if you can walk away and if you can leave, which you can if you're not bound together, then you're not going to withstand the horrible process of heat and pressure that's required to make you transform. You'll just walk around that. You'll just look for an excuse. I mean, people look for an excuse not to do that anyways. And so part of the reason you get married is so you're desperate enough to change. And maybe that doesn't even work. The reason I'm defending freedom of speech, because that's how people with different opinions settle their opinions in a civil society. And if we lose
As you might imagine, you've been a topic of conversation on this campus a lot in the past week or so, certainly among a lot of us who discuss politics. And one of the things that sort of united people who like and dislike a lot of your ideas is that we appreciate your defense of free speech, and we appreciate you coming here to talk about it with us. But one of the things I thought was really interesting is Professor Van Dyke addressed the distinction between you and Jonathan Haidt. And you mentioned this as sort of a temperamental one. And I think, I'm sure that's true to some extent, but I noticed you've made a lot of more sort of substantively inflammatory claims. Like in the course of this lecture, you called the authors of Facebook posts demons and totalitarians. In past events, you've called them things like neo-Marxists, cultural Marxists. You've called them, I believe, a fifth column that is committing treason against the West. And it seems to me this is more than temperamental. This is a substantive difference. And
it's a substantive difference, yes.
And another thing you've done is that, unlike Haidt, you have a more sort of comprehensive political program. You've talked a lot in defense of traditional hierarchies, both of gender, of class, so on, though emphatically not of race. And so it seems that...
I haven't talked about defense of traditional hierarchies in terms of gender and class. That's not true.
Well, you've talked about hierarchies in society. You've talked
Yeah,
about
that's true. I have done
would you
that,
not define
but I
that as
haven't
class?
justified them on the basis of gender and class.
You
whatever it
well,
the two
okay, but
categories.
you talk
Not
about,
okay. That's an important distinction.
Okay, but you defend hierarchies in society in a way that you talk a lot about the Pareto distribution. Yes.
That doesn't mean I defend it.
Well, okay.
No, not okay.
Yes. Well, I mean, I think you talk
Observing that something exists is not the same as defending it. How in the world?
Well, people attack it, right?
What's that?
And you don't. People attack it.
Attack
it's inherently attack the hierarchies of society is inherently unjust, right?
Well, they're unjust, but they're also useful.
Okay, so you say they're useful. Some
Well,
people would disagree
look at
with
it
that
this way.
proposition.
Okay, look at it this way. You obviously think that it's worthwhile to stand up and ask a question.
Yes.
So you think that standing up and asking a question is better than not standing up and asking the question.
Yes.
Okay, that's a hierarchy.
Yes.
Of values.
Yes.
Okay, without the hierarchy of values, you couldn't act.
Of course.
No, not of course.
Well, wait.
It's partly why I'm
I think
defending
there's
the
a distinction here.
hierarchy. Without
No
a
one
hierarchy,
disagrees
there's
about
no
the
impetus
facts
to
of
act.
the hierarchy, right?
What's that?
There is a hierarchy in society, right?
No, there's multiple hierarchies
Okay, there are
in
multiple
society.
hierarchies in society, right?
Yes.
And you say that they are based in, you invoke the lobster, right? That they are based in nature.
I said that they were inevitable.
Yes, that they were inevitable. Some
Right,
people
that
disagree
doesn't
with
mean
that.
that they're
but,
good.
But my point is that, this is generally relevant to it, you have a broader point than free speech. This is one of the things you talk about, yes?
Yes.
Okay. Whereas I think there are some other activists who focus on more exclusively
I'm not
on
an
free speech.
activist.
There are some other individuals who engage in public political speech. Okay.
Yeah.
Who focus more exclusively on free speech, whereas you have other goals in mind. But one of the things that your more inflammatory language, and it's fair, it's a substantive disagreement, has done, I think, is it's politicized this free speech to an extent that someone like Haidt hasn't. I've noticed that when someone hears the term free speech now, they associate it with a specific set of thinkers, often as viewed as on the extreme right. And I think arguably that's the problem of all factions in society, because free speech should be a universal value. Polls certainly suggest that it's coming under increasing threat from both sides. But I suppose the heart of my question, in addition to, of course, these other observations, is that do you believe free speech is your primary end, or do you believe these other points you're making are important? Because I've heard you a bunch of times defend free speech sort of contextually, like you've complained about some of the laws in Canada that you dislike, that they institutionalize false facts into the law. But it seems to me that an absolutist defense of free speech makes no preference as to true or false. The point is that's something you are being forced to say something. It would be as bad as if you were forced to say something that is true, because the point of free speech is that you can say whatever you want, right?
No,
And-
the point of free speech is so that you can think your way through life without running
but
headlong
being
into
told
a brick
to
wall.
think, I think the politicization of free speech is by far the biggest threat to free speech, because this has always
No,
been
the radical leftists are the biggest threat
well,
to free
okay,
speech.
so this is a disagreement.
But I get your
as
point.
The professor alluded to in previous questions, the substantive threats to free speech in much of the world, in Europe certainly, I think in the United States as well, from the government have come from the radical right. And I think it's fair to say that on the specific narrow subset of certain departments on liberal arts colleges, it's fair to say a threat comes from the left, though its scope is in dispute. But my question is, do you think that the way you talk about free speech, the way you link it to specific issues, the way you use inflammatory language, and the way you seem to make it, you seem to defend a specific set of free speech. There are certainly plenty of instances of free speech attacked on the other side that you don't mention as much. Do you think you risk politicizing this? Because it seems to me
Yes.
that, okay, and do you
risk.
not think that's a far greater threat? Because, for example, the
No.
NRA, the NRA is a group in the United States that defends guns rights, right?
Okay, hold it.
Yes.
We need a question.
Yes. Okay.
I mean,
My
like I
question is
said, you're doing fine,
do you
but
think-
it's just too
Yes.
much. Like I can't keep it
Do
straight.
you think that your behavior risks politicizing it, and do you think that politicization is justified?
I think my behavior risks politicizing it, yes. I would rather it not be politicized. And I'm doing what I can to manage that risk. However, it's become political in my country because the government implemented compelled speech legislation. So I wasn't complaining about that before it became political. Now, and there is a time, even when you're detached in some sense from the political realm, that you can't be detached anymore. Well, I'm not happy with the fact that this has become politicized. You could say that I haven't done a stellar job in ensuring in every possible manner that this has remained neutrally apolitical. Probably true, but
I'm not particularly unhappy with the way things have gone so far. So, and I'm not happy with the radical left. And so if they're irritated at me, so much the better, as far as I'm concerned. So have I conducted myself perfectly? It's like, undoubtedly no. So I've got more than my fair share of faults, and a temper is one of them. But I'm muddling through. We're trying to put together something like an alternative vision of the future, say an alternative to that kind of apocalyptic narrative that's being put forward, at least implicitly, by organizations like the WEF, you know, and that's the virginal planet, rapacious tyrant, you know, all-devouring consumer religion. And it's more like something like, well, we want to ask people 6 key questions. Okay, so how do we get energy and resources at the lowest possible cost, as rapidly as possible, to the largest number of people around the world? That's one question. And so there's a presumption in the question, and here's one of the presumptions. You don't get to save the planet by making energy prices so expensive that no one poor can afford them. That's off the table. So if you want to develop alternative energy sources, no problem. You know, because, hey man, the more energy sources we have, the better. But you don't get to impose your utopian vision in the service of your narcissism on the poor. We're going to try to make the poor rich. Can I try to alleviate absolute poverty? Pro-human view. On environmental stewardship front, that's the next question. What are the major problems that are confronting us? How do we take a sophisticated, multidimensional view of that? How do we prioritize our attempts to establish our states and our international relationships properly so that we prioritize human well-being, you know, in harmony with nature to the degree that's possible, but human-focused and not predicated on the idea that there are too many goddamn mouths on the planet to feed and that you're evil if you just think about having children. So then on the governance front, this is where it gets kind of more left-wing, I would say, is none of the people involved in this consortium so far are very thrilled with global corporate fascist government media and corporation collusion. You know, and we're seeing this at the high end. It's like a Tower of Babel, is that the powerful players in the world are increasingly collaborating to impose a top-down vision of the future on everyone. And that's a future that's predicated on a zero-growth model, and the idea that, well, we'd need 5 planets really to support everyone at the current standard of living that obtains in the West, so the best pathway forward is to deny loans by the World Bank to developing countries so they can't develop, you know, energy sources, which all that'll mean is they're going to burn wood and coal, obviously. So that's the third question is, you know, how do we arrange systems of governance to stop the march of something like pathological gigantism? This is why I like people like Russell Brand and also you to some degree politically, you know, because you guys are very, what would you say, sensitive to the danger of that kind of corrupt collusion, that regulatory capture that occurs when corporate entities and media entities and governmental entities are all in bed together, like the FDA and the CDC and so forth and so on without end. So that's the third question. The fourth question is, what do we put forward as a vision on the family policy front to facilitate the, what would you call it, the encouragement and the maintenance of long-term monogamous couples who are child-centered, and to make increasing the birth rate part of that policy, to put policies in place that would support long-term stable monogamous families, 2-parent families, and child-centered. You know, because in the West, because we're very immature, we think that the purpose of a marriage is the happiness of the people who are involved in the marriage, the husband and the wife. And that's just not the purpose of marriage at all. The purpose is long-term facilitation of their psychological and spiritual development and the establishment of an environment that's beneficial to children. That's a responsible way of thinking about it. And so we need to have a serious conversation about what that means. And, you know, it's tricky because, like, I think the ideal has to be long-term committed monogamous heterosexual relationships. And I had a big conversation about this with Dave Rubin. You know, Rubin's gay and he's married, and him and his partner now have 2 infants, and we talked through how that was. It was a very hard thing for them to arrange, obviously. Why? Well, they're both male. So that poses a severe problem on the reproductive front, right? And so they managed that, and they have 2 infants, but it's very complex, and it's obviously not a solution to the problem of relationship and reproduction that's duplicatable across large numbers of people. It just takes too many resources. Now, I do think we have to have an ideal at the center of every concept. But the ideal can't be too rigid, you know, because people aren't perfect. You know, in my own family, there's lots of people who are divorced. Lots of people, in lots of people's families, there are people who are gay. You know, there are lots of people in unhappy marriages. Nobody attains the ideal. So the ideal has to be surrounded by a fringe of tolerance, but that doesn't mean you sacrifice the ideal. Well, we know there's a literature on fatherlessness. You know, it's a bloody catastrophe, fatherlessness, for obvious reasons. You know, human children are complicated. You think you can, maybe if you struggle madly as a single parent, you could do a decent job, and lots of single parents do, but you're asking a lot, you know, for a woman to work 50 hours a week and then spend another 40 hours with her kids, and to do both of those optimally with no help. You know, and we know perfectly well that when women get divorced, especially if they have kids, they tend to fall down the economic hierarchy. So it's very difficult. So that's another one of the policies. Then another question. We're trying to make these into questions rather than, you know, we have the answer. The other question is, well, it's pretty clear that we have to live inside a story. And one story is power rules everything. But that's not a very good story. It's a very pathological story. It's more like a confession, too, if that's the story you insist upon. It's like, so you think power governs everything, do you? Okay, I know what you're like. So that's what you truly believe. See, I believe the spirit of voluntary play governs everything, not the spirit of power. It's like voluntary association. That's what we're doing in this conversation. You know, we're playing towards an end, and we're doing it voluntarily, and we're taking everybody along for the ride. No one's forced to do it. So that's the other thing. No compulsion here. It's got to be invitational. And so we're trying to work out what the story has to be. And on that front, part of the model that we're trying to put forward in this group that I'm describing is based on this principle of subsidiarity, and the idea that we want to encourage everyone to take as much responsibility as possible at the most local level possible, right? So take responsibility for yourself until you're good enough at that so you can take responsibility maybe for a wife, and then if you're good enough at that, maybe you can extend that to some kids, and then maybe you can serve your local community, and then maybe you can serve your state, and maybe if you really get good at it, you could serve your nation, right? But you're taking the responsibility, and here's the basic rule. All the responsibility you abdicate will be taken up by tyrants. That's the cardinal rule of social organization. And so we're trying to build out this story that's based on the deepest elements of Western tradition, that's an antidote to the false claim that it's only power that rules, because it's not. That's not right. And there is a model of proper governance in there, this idea of a hierarchical structure of responsibility. It's the proper computational structure. It's not top-down tyranny with fractionated individuals, and it's not utter chaos. It's ordered freedom. And so we're trying to work all that out. Now we're going to have a conference in London. We're going to bring about 2,000 people together. That's an invited list. We want to bring in people who are cultural figures and political figures, business figures, and invite them to this discussion. But we want to make that completely public, and we want to open up the organization to broad membership, as broad as possible. And then, you know, if it's a success, then we'll open up the conferences as the years progress to larger and larger numbers of people. I've got all sorts of people on board in Australia and all through Europe and through the UK and all through the United States, South America. All sorts of people are interested in participating. And so we want to help put forward a vision that's enticing and inviting. Imagine you could have the world you wanted. You know, none of this Malthusian limits to growth nonsense. We get our act together. Everyone can have it. Can have enough, and maybe more than enough. There'll be enough educational opportunity for everyone. No one will be scrabbling away in the dirt, burning dung, poisoning themselves. Enough food for everyone. And all of that's going to come down the pipes within the next year. Hang on to your hats, ladies and gentlemen. Giants are going to walk the earth once more, and we're going to live through that, maybe.
I think we need to really be, I think we need to regulate AI safety, frankly. Think of any technology which is potentially a risk to people, like if it's aircraft or cars or medicine. We have regulatory bodies that oversee the public safety. It is, I think, actually a bigger risk.
How many of you know what ChatGPT is? Not very many. So I'll tell you what ChatGPT is, just so you know, because you need to know this. And I don't know what sort of technological revolution this is. Gutenberg press level? It's something like that. This is a big deal. So this AI system It's a general language processing model, was released about a week and a half ago, and I went and interacted with it. It's an AI system, artificial intelligence system. It basically is trained on, well, a massive corpus of spoken or of text. So it's derived its models of the world from the analysis of human speech, essentially. It isn't using real world data yet, but that will be happening certainly within the next year. So, and ChatGPT analyzes a very large corpus of text, and that corpus is growing all the time. Now, it's already sophisticated enough. I went on to it last week and I said, okay, some of you know I've written these books, 12 Rules for Life, and then Beyond Order, 12 more rules, because, you know, you can't have enough rules. And I asked it, this is what I asked it to do. I said, write me an essay that's a 13th rule for Beyond Order, written in a style that combines the King James Bible with the Tao Te Ching. That's pretty difficult to pull off, you know. Any one of those things is hard. The intersection of all three, that's impossible. Well, it wrote it in about 3 seconds, 4 pages long, and it isn't obvious to me, for better or worse, that I would be able to tell that I didn't write it. Right, and okay, and that's pretty impressive, although, you know, maybe not its relationship to what I've written, but the fact that it could do that grammatically perfectly, right, and quite impressive philosophically. I also had it write an essay on the intersection between the Taoist version of ethical morality and the ethics that are outlined in the Sermon on the Mount, which it just nailed, got that dead right, brilliant. Again, it took it about 3 seconds. There was a computer engineer who purported to work for Tesla. He asked ChatGPT, he said, look, I work for Elon Musk, but I haven't been doing much for the last week, so I need you to write me 10 bullet points about what I probably would have done as a engineer at Twitter. What 10 things did I do last week that were productive and valuable? And, oh, if you don't mind, write me the accompanying computer code that goes with each project. And it did that too, 3 seconds, and the computer code works. Right, and so, okay, so that's already there. So then a university professor did this. He thought, oh, that's interesting. Any student will be able to write any essay on any topic with ChatGPT. And someone gave it an SAT, by the way, and it scored about as well as the average student in a well-functioning public university. So that's how smart it is. So that's basically an IQ test. He said, write me an essay, gave it a topic, wrote the essay. He said, now grade it. Said if we can automate the students, we should be able to automate the professors too. And so it provided a complete, comprehensive analysis of its own essay with grade. Someone else asked it, write the screenplay and describe the characters for the next $900 million Hollywood blockbuster. It's like, bang, plot, characterizations. Then someone else took the descriptions of the actors and said, generate photorealistic computer images for each actor. And all the AI systems could do that. So I'm going to tell you what's going to happen next. Now we have an AI model that can extract a model of the world from the entire corpus of language. All right, and it's smarter than you, and it's going to be a hell of a lot smarter than you in 2 years. So you can get ready for that too. But it's not that smart yet because it's just a humanities professor at the moment. It doesn't test its linguistic knowledge against the real world. That's what a scientist does, right? You come up with a theory that's linguistically predicated, and then you throw it against the world and see if it sticks. And then the world tells you whether or not your linguistic construction is valid. But the new AI systems will be able to extract out patterns from the world itself, from images and so forth, and then be able to test their linguistic constructions against the world, and so they'll practice just like scientists. And the most advanced models are going to use text and image and action as well, because they'll be able to model human action. And so, and all of that's going to come down the pipes within the next year. So hang on to your hats, ladies and gentlemen, because what did my friend Jonathan Pajot say? Giants are going to walk the earth once more. And we're going to live through that, maybe.
Professor Peterson, let's begin with you. Why are you against the use of alternate pronouns?
I'm against the use of legislation to determine what words that myself and other people are required to utter.
But would you use alternate pronouns if a student asked you to?
I think I've made my position on that clear already.
Well, perhaps not to our audience at home who are just being introduced to this. Would you use alternate pronouns? And why not?
Because I don't believe that other people have the right to determine what language I use, especially when it's backed by punitive legislation. And when the words that are being required are the constructions, they're artificial constructions of people I regard as radical ideologues whose viewpoint I do not share.
Now we're diving deeper into why Peterson is so fired up. He's not just pushing back on pronouns, he's challenging the idea of legislating language. Imagine if you had to get government approval for the slang you use. It feels absurd, right? Peterson's point is that enforcing this by law creates a slippery slope. Philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche once said, "The surest way to corrupt a youth is to instruct him to hold in higher esteem those who think alike than those who think differently." Peterson seems to embody that here, insisting on protecting the messy, uncomfortable, but vital process of disagreement.
We have a graphic to show our audience at home, just some of the pronouns being used or asked to be used as alternates. Among them you see here Z or Zim, Z or here, Z or Zir, also hey, or a rather, and per. So just some of the alternate pronouns there. Professor Pete, when you hear Professor Peterson saying that this is oppressive, how do you respond to that?
The Peterson drama has done real harm to real people on campus. He's made it harder to be transgender or non-binary. I know this from personal experience. I'm non-binary and transgender, and I know how it's felt to be on the U of T campus for the last month. And I also know from private communications with other affected people. In New Zealand, where I grew up, academics have a statutory role enshrined in the Education Act to be a critic and conscience of society. So I think that's an idea worth exporting to Canada. So I'd like to give Peterson about a B+ for his critic role recently, and an F for the conscience part. A student once said to me when I finally obtained tenure, "Now, Professor, now that you have obtained superpowers, you must agree to use them for good, for peace and justice." So I invite Peterson to start doing more of that.
Well, Professor Peterson, those who are asking for this alternate use of alternate pronouns, they are saying it boils down to respecting their human rights. How do you respond to that?
I don't think it boils down to respecting their human rights. I think that it's an imposition on freedom of speech that's being implemented at a legislative level. I also think that if there was a naturally evolving solution to the linguistic problem that's being posed by a small fraction of the transgender community, that people would have already adopted it. We've never had a situation in the usage of English before that required legislation to produce a transformation in the manner in which people spoke. Has a very dangerous precedent. So it's one thing to tell people what they can't say. So, for example, we have legislation making it illegal to do such things as deny the Holocaust. It's a completely different thing to demand that people use certain words when they're formulating their own ideas. And it's also absurd. I mean, here's one thing that's happened that I don't believe the formulators of this legislation ever foresaw. So in New York City, for example, there are now 31 protected gender identities. And I see no reason whatsoever why each of those gender identities can't demand the use of their own pronoun. And that absurd things like that have been happening on the University of Michigan campus, for example, where students have been given permission to tell faculty members and others what pronouns they're to be addressed by, and they're multiplying rapidly out of control. So the law is bad from an ethical perspective. It's sloppily written, and besides that, the solution that it imposes is practically untenable.
Here's where things get spicy. Peterson paints a picture of a world where language spirals into chaos, with pronouns multiplying faster than Marvel spin-offs. It's easy to laugh, but he's making a bigger point about practicality. At what point does accommodating everyone's preferences become unmanageable? It's like being in a group text where everyone insists on their own nickname. Suddenly you've got Captain Sunshine, Code Ninja, and Spaghetti Wizard, and nobody knows who's who.
I want to bring in Professor Pete here because we did show those words to our audience at home, and perhaps the control room can show it to our audience once again. When you look at those alternate pronouns, I think it's fair to say that some people will see that at home and see that as very unwieldy, if you will. What do you say to those types of criticisms, including the one you just heard from Professor Peterson?
Well, I'd like to encourage people struggling with this to be kind as their first impulse. You know, we call somebody what they want to be called in our society. For instance, I don't call somebody Julie if they prefer to be called Jordan. That's just basic human courtesy.
Now, Professor Pete brings up kindness as the core value here, which sounds nice, until Peterson jumps in and says, not so fast. This clash is fascinating because it highlights two worldviews. One prioritizes empathy, the other prioritizes truth. It's like choosing between a soft pillow and a sturdy chair. Both have value, but which one do you want to rely on? Peterson's point is that truth sometimes requires discomfort, like telling your best friend their karaoke rendition of Adele wasn't exactly Grammy-worthy. Sure, it stings, but it's necessary for growth.
Here's a great little tip for people who are despairing at the possibility of remembering all those pronouns. What I do is just program in the pronoun next to the person's name in my smartphone. So whenever I'm out and about and I've forgotten whether one of my trans friends uses ze or zer or they or them or something else, I just look it up and it's really super easy. One thing I'd like you to really look at in regard to this controversy is to watch out for who's getting centered in a discussion. Political correctness is code that powerful people use when they're annoyed that they're actually not the center of attention in any given discussion. And Bill C-16 is actually not about cisgender people, it's about protections for transgender people. And that's not, it's not about Jordan Peterson. So, we should have people learning to listen more. We have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a very good reason. When things get political, I like to ask who benefits and who gets to decide the rules of the game. So, mostly with this Peterson controversy, which is really just a small drama, a tempest in a teapot, he could just get over learning to program a few pronouns into his phone. By the way, I only have half a dozen or so that I actually use on an everyday basis, so it's not all that difficult.
Professor Peterson, Professor Peterson, jump in because I think Professor Peterson wants to get in on that.
Yeah, well, kindness is the excuse that social justice warriors use when they want to exercise control over what other people think and say. So, if we're bandying back and forth our differences in values, I would say that the highest possible value is truth, and that one of the concomitants is that we need stringent protection for freedom of speech so that we can utter the truths that we see fit. And I think that that's a value that's much higher than kindness, for example. I mean, there's lots of situations in life where kindness in the immediate present is not the appropriate way to react at all.
But
so, for example, when you discipline children, you often hurt their feelings in the short term so that they can learn to behave properly in the medium to long term so that their lives go well. And so this automatic assumption that the people on the social justice warrior side of the equation are motivated only by kindness when they're also clearly motivated by power is something I find completely untenable. And I don't think that Pete's solution to program my cell phone so that I can remember what names people need to be called is a reasonable solution at all. We're actually supposed to now use electronic devices to bolster our ability to speak freely.
Peterson elevates the debate here, connecting freedom of speech to society's ability to solve problems. He's saying, without open dialogue, we're blindfolded in a maze. Carl Jung once said, thinking is difficult. That's why most people judge. This is Peterson's battle cry, to think critically, even when it's uncomfortable, because that's how progress happens. Love him or hate him, he's arguing for a world where ideas compete and evolve, not where they're silenced by decree.
You remember names, Jordan? Someone? Is it so difficult to remember a pronoun? You remember somebody's first name, you remember their telephone number. I mean, I think that it's
I don't
very,
remember
very
people's
true
first names
that
very easily, and I don't remember their telephone numbers very easily. And when I see a stranger, I call them by the pronoun that seems to be in accordance with their presented appearance. And
that's you
they
being
appear
lazy,
that way.
Jordan. That's you being lazy. I think there's a very high value that we should also be aiming for in addition to truth. By the way, throughout this whole controversy, controversy, I have told the truth at every turn. So, you know, trying to imply that that's not what's happening on people on the social justice, am I a social justice warrior? I don't know. But I think that we should be aiming for pluralism. This means recognizing more than one set of fundamental principles, fostering independent cultural traditions of minorities, and being willing to share power with people who are different than you. I think if you just stop centering this whole controversy on yourself and how hard it is for you to accommodate genderqueer people, well, have a little bit of sympathy. I mean, those of us who are trans encounter much more greater indignities every day and every week of the month. For example, have you recently had a bank employee accuse you of trying to masquerade as yourself at a bank and then locking down your ATM card and credit card so that you can't use any money? Those are the sorts of problems that trans people face every day, being out of housing, being considered, you know, considering suicide. These are really big problems.
My refusal to use pronouns because left-wing activists want me to use them has nothing to do with whether or not trans people are having difficulties in society. And I'd also like to point out that I've had many letters of support.
Problem, isn't it?
I've had many letters of support from trans people, and they tell me that the trans activists don't support them, and most trans people
Jordan,
actually wanted to be referred to as he or she.
Doesn't mean
they
that
weren't
you
my
are
friends.
Untransphobic.
They
just
weren't
because
my
you
friends.
know a few people, just because you've talked to a few trans people, you don't know the trans community like the trans community does.
Professor Peterson, I'm sorry to interrupt. Let's let Professor Peterson finish his thought, please.
All right. So, the trans activists aren't proper representatives of the trans community because they haven't been elected by the trans community.
Nobody elected
they're noisy.
You either, Jordan.
I'm not speaking for anyone except myself and on behalf of other people perhaps who want to maintain the right to free speech. I'm not claiming that I'm a representative of white people or white men or any other group. I'm speaking on behalf of myself. And so I'm not taking...
But Professor Peterson, let me jump in there, though, because we have seen an evolution of language. There are words that we don't use anymore.
Not by legislation.
Well, legislation or not, there are words that have evolved. We don't use, for example, I'm Asian. I would bristle if someone called me Oriental. That is an evolution of how we use words. How is this different, whether legislated or not?
I understand
legislation is how it's different. I understand legislatively, but if at the heart of it is to allow a student to study free of what they feel is discrimination, why not help that along?
I already made my case for why not help that along. I believe that this legislation is extraordinarily dangerous, and there's other elements of it too that we haven't even got to in our society yet, like the protection for gender expression. And I've looked at gender expression in the Ontario Human Rights Code, and as far as I can tell, gender expression is best summarized in a single word: fashion. No. Because it's the way that you present yourself in public with your clothing and your manner of dress. And so I also think that the legislation that we are bringing forth with Bill C-16, and that's already in place in places like Ontario, also makes fashion criticism something akin to a hate crime. And because there's been so much noise about the identity component of this, we haven't even talked about gender expression. This is appalling legislation. And the idea that referring to someone by the pronoun of their choice is going to radically improve their status in society or their mental health is a completely unproven assumption. I think it'll have exactly the opposite effect.
This is Peterson's mic drop moment. He challenges the assumption that mandating pronouns will lead to better outcomes for marginalized communities. It's provocative, sure, but he's asking us to critically evaluate the effectiveness of these policies. Imagine trying to fix a leaky roof by repainting it. It looks good, but does it solve the problem? Peterson's critique pushes us to think beyond surface solutions and address the root causes of inequality and mental health challenges.
I'm perfectly willing to be held accountable for my actions, and the university has already indicated the seriousness with which they view my actions. And I also do not believe that free speech laws were there to protect to regulate violence. Free speech laws are there because we use free speech to identify problems in our society, generate solutions to the problems, and then reach a consensus. So freedom of speech is actually is protection for the mechanism by which our individuals and society properly orient themselves across time. It's not even a principle, it's the fundamental method by which our societies manage to maintain the stability that they do maintain. And
it's one of the ways we do that, yes.
Well, I would say that it's the fundamental way. So, and I mean, I think we could have a reasonable discussion about that, but because freedom of speech is so tightly tangled up with the means by which we solve problems, I mean, I think, and then I talk, but I get corrected when I speak publicly. And the fact that I'm being corrected constantly by the people that I'm speaking with helps orient my speech properly and helps orient public discussion properly.
So, what's the big takeaway here? This debate isn't just about pronouns or free speech. It's about the kind of society we want to build. Peterson is making a bold stand for open dialogue, even when it's messy or uncomfortable. He's arguing that legislating language sets a dangerous precedent, not just for freedom of speech, but for how we solve problems as a society. At the heart of it is a question: how do we balance kindness with truth? Peterson suggests that prioritizing kindness over truth might lead to unintended consequences, like stifling debate or creating unworkable systems. Friedrich Nietzsche once said, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." Peterson's why is clear: protecting the process of honest conversation, no matter how hard it gets. This conversation challenges us to think deeply about what we value more: consensus or dialogue, comfort or progress. It's a call to action for all of us, not just to listen, but to participate. Because at the end of the day, the world moves forward when people are willing to wrestle with tough questions, not silence them. So, let's keep the conversation going in the comments. What do you think? Is Peterson right? Or is this debate missing the point?
Someone released a clip of me talking about some of the things we just talked about. And it went out on YouTube Shorts, and it's got like 5 million views in a month or something like that. And the comment section is unbelievably vitriolic. Every single comment is vitriolic. And it's all from women. It's like, who is this old white bastard telling us what we should do with our bodies?
Do you see the ONS data that came out a couple of weeks ago that said for the first time ever since records began, 50.1% of women are childless by 30? So there are more women without children at 30 than there are women with children. The first time ever.
Well, somebody clipped a part of one of my podcasts, I believe it was, where I was talking about what our society does to 19-year-old women, or 18-year-old women, 19-year-old women. We just lie to them all the time. The first lie is, there's nothing more important than your career, more or less by definition. So that's the first lie. The second lie is, there will be nothing more important to you in your life than your career. And so that's the second lie. And then the third lie is, there should be nothing more important in your life than your career. So that's the third lie. And then implicit in that is the idea that children are a burden, and that the idea that women should have children is part of the oppressive patriarchy and should be resisted. And who are men to tell me what I can do with my body? Hey, fair enough. And et cetera, et cetera. Now, I've worked in female-dominated occupations my entire life. For example, I worked as a daycare worker way back when, that was like 1980, something like that. And there were no men doing that, but I really liked kids, and so that was fun. And I worked for social services in Alberta in the child care department, and then I've been working as a psychologist, either training or as a psychologist since then, and that's been a female-dominated enterprise increasingly as the years went by. But even when I first entered it, so I'm in the post-female in the workplace generation firmly. I never experienced the world except as that, and so I've watched women progress through their professional careers at every level of attainment, from the lowest to the highest, and observed what happened, and relatively, I would say, bias-free, because I didn't know. And what I've seen is that as women progress towards their late 20s, there's a psychological transformation, and what happens is that they place less emphasis on their career and way more emphasis, particularly on having a child. And that really reaches a crisis point around 29 or 30 for the vast majority of women, and their attitude flips. And I've seen it flip very dramatically with many women. And I suppose the most convincing evidence of that, I worked with high-end lawyers in Toronto for about 10 years. I was part of an organization. We went to law firms high-end law firms and said, send us your most productive people and we'll help them iron out whatever wrinkles there might still be in their life. And the advantage to them is that things will go better for them, and the advantage to you is they'll be even more productive. And there's a good management dictum, which is pay the most attention to your most productive people because they're bringing in the bulk of your revenue disproportionately. And so I worked with men and women who were at the peak of their careers in a very difficult enterprise. And so these were women who were generally very attractive, well put together physically, pretty stable psychologically, extremely conscientious, very, very smart, and high achieving from like junior high all the way through high school, university, law school, onto the top firms, rocketing up through the ranks, full partnership by the time they were 29 or 30. And all the law firms, all the women bailed out, all of them. The law firms couldn't keep them. And I was really, and I talked to the women a lot about this because I was very interested in it, because I knew the law firms were bending themselves over backwards and tying themselves into knots trying to retain these women, because why wouldn't they? You know, just being greedy capitalists is enough. You know, they don't want to lose their high-performing women because they're performing at the highest level, and they couldn't keep them. The women wanted to have 9-to-5 jobs. They wanted to bind the job so they could have a life, and that was especially true once they got interested in having a child or had one. And what they really came to was a very interesting realization. So because they were highly conscientious women, they sort of did their duty and worked hard and diligently and didn't pop their head up to ask questions. They were in junior high, they got the best grades. They were in high school, they got the best grades, and so on, all the way through, right till they reached partnership. But that's sort of an apogee, right? You hit partnership in a senior law firm, it's like you're at the top of your profession. Well, then what? Well, so then they looked around and they thought, here I am with all these like hyper-competitive men, perfectly willing to work 80 hours a week, nonstop, to stay at the top. What the hell are they doing? Because that's the real question. What is it that characterizes this small percentage of hyper-competitive men? It's not. You can assume that that's how everyone should be, but first of all, that isn't how everyone is. Or you can flip that and say, well, there's only a small minority of human beings that are willing to do this, to work flat out 8 hours a week. I mean, they're certainly being paid for it. Let's make no mistake about that. But well, what about the rest of life? Well, that's what the women asked. Why am I doing this? And that's a great question. Well, for men, there's a different answer than for women. It's a really different answer. And it isn't like the men are exactly thinking this through. It's more like this is an integral part of male motivation. The more successful you are as a man, the more women like you. I released a video. I was going to conclude that other story. I released a video, or someone released a clip of me talking about some of the things we just talked about. And it went out on YouTube Shorts, and it's got like 5 million views in a month or something like that. And the comment section is unbelievably vitriolic. Every single comment is vitriolic, and it's all from women. It's like, who is this old white bastard telling us what we should do with our bodies? You know, and I wasn't being judgmental. I was just saying exactly what I said to you, which is, well, I've watched women over the entire course of my life with, I would say, an affectionate eye. You know, I love my sister, I love my wife, I have a daughter, I love my mother. I'm pretty happy about women, all things considered. I don't have an axe to grind in relationship to how they should conduct their lives. I don't even know how they should conduct their lives. I've watched what happens. And I've also watched what happens to women who hit 29 or 30 and then can't conceive. And that is not a fate I would wish on anyone. It's awful. And 30% of couples fall into that. 30% of couples have difficulty conceiving. It's a lot. And the probability that you'll have difficulty conceiving increases with age. And so, you know, c'est la vie. But it's very interesting to me to see how vitriolic those comments have been and how uniform that is, because usually on my YouTube channel in particular, 95% of the comments are positive. And this is completely the opposite of that.